on a hot afternoon of May 10th, 1931, some army officers, grieving the end of the reign of their lately deposed king, met in a clubhouse in the Spanish capital of Madrid and took to drink. They also took to song, playing the Royal March on phonographs, opening their windows and blasting it out into the street. Passers-by, typical of Madrileños whose families owned no land and swore no oath of loyalty to the king, were still giddy with the arrival of the Second Spanish Republic. The Republic promised a relief to the dire circumstances of their lives, as exhausted laborers, or downtrodden clerks, or henpecked waiters, a promise to dignify labor with recompense, and banish the faint whispers of a hunger that never quite left them. That bellowing royal march was a haughty reply from the forces of traditional order that none of these promises would be kept. The army, packed with monarchist officers, would see to that. In the day's heat, fighting broke out between the Madrileños and the army officers, the common people of the city against the armed emissaries of the landowners of the country. Soon the violence spread across the city as the people of that city mobilized to strike against their enemies. The news of the riot shot through fresh veins of communication infrastructure to cities and even villages across the Spanish countryside. Fires alighted in thousands of ready hearts. They were out to assert themselves against the one institution whose injustice and oppression transcended geographic region or sector of employment. An institution that, unlike the buildings of the government, was largely left unguarded. So crowds gathered at the churches and convents that dominated the culture of Spain, where God's spokesman consecrated as holy their unending suffering. Now, most city dwellers and the poor of the villages, who had not inherited a trade from their artisan forebears, were the children of peasants who'd been driven from the land and into wage labor on farms or cities. These were the children who had made the terrible journey into the unknown. They had encountered a world starkly different from their lives in the villages, and from this new angle, the eternal truths of the church were exposed as the lies of an antichrist who worked to keep them in chains. Contempt for the church was not constrained to the laboring classes either. For the more educated professionals of the city, the church stood for medieval superstition that lay like a yoke around the neck of Spain. Whatever the source of disgust, the newly established republic provided a political outlet for generations of visceral hatred for the symbols, infrastructure, and above all, personnel of the Catholic Church. So in the next 2 days, over 200 churches, convents, and religious buildings were burned in cities and villages across southern Spain. The crowds burned churches to display their loyalty to the Republic, which represented a path to the establishment of a true faith, a faith in the common people's fitness to rule themselves. They also acted, though, because burning churches was a traditional form of entertainment in Spain, and had been since the 19th century, when the authority and credibility of the clerical class with the landless was permanently shattered. Priests were corrupt and cynical creatures of the lords who had cast them off the land. If people were excited, burning down their houses sent a good message, and it was a damn fun time. The church burnings were a portent for the future of the, spoiler alert, short-lived Second Spanish Republic. The introduction of mass democracy to a population suffering deep immiseration and apocalyptic inequality, a population with no prospect of imperial spoils to ease the pain and provide social purpose, meant that political change was always occurring in the aftermath of spontaneous violence generated by unrestrained class conflict. Other Western European nations had developed strong central authorities capable of arranging the various carrots and sticks necessary to secure class peace. Incapable of competing with those other states for colonial markets, Spain needed to modernize its economy to assert its interests within the world capitalist system. The Republic would survive only if it could build the state capacity to channel the heat radiating off of this class conflict into economic productivity and away from cycles of ritualistic civic violence. Unfortunately, the Republic lacked any symbol capable of stretching across Spain's political divide, because the last mystic knot tying the modern Spanish state to the glories of the Spanish Empire from the time before the intrusion of capitalism had just been cut. A month before the church is burned, on April 14th, 1931, Alfonso Leon, Fernando Maria, Jaime Isidor Pascuala, Antonio de Borbón y Habsburgo Lorena, aka King Alfonso XIII of Spain, departed the country for foreign exile. Municipal election results, which had seen huge anti-monarchical majorities in Spain's cities, coupled with waves of student strikes and a show of no confidence from his generals, drove King Alfonso from the throne. Liberal and socialist political leaders, who had come together the year before to form the Republican Pact of San Sebastian, seized the moment to declare a second Spanish Republic. Now you're probably asking, what about that first Spanish Republic? Well, it only lasted from February 1874 to December 1875 before being brought down by a military coup. In the Spanish tradition, they're called pronunciamientos, or pronouncements, and they happen so often that they have their own special name. The military had been the final arbiter of Spanish politics since the Napoleonic invasion of 1809 shattered the ancient regime. The classes of Spanish society who placed their hope in the Second Republic, the liberal cosmopolitans of the urban small bourgeois, the organized urban workers, and those millennium-seeking rural proletarians, were all united in their hope of seeing this republic withstand the test of time. Only through the instrument of the republic would Spain be delivered into the condition of a modern country while honoring the humanity of her citizenry. The military had stood by while Alfonso fell, which proved that while it's a conservative institution, it was not existentially hostile to the republic. They're waiting to see what'll happen. But the reactionary character of the Spanish officer corps, which is almost entirely drawn from the ranks of the rural landowning class who saw the monarchs as the guarantors of their property and rights, meant that the army would always be a sword pointed at the republic's throat. Unless the republic built sufficient legitimacy across Spanish society that the military wouldn't dare challenge it. Spaniards had a republic now if they could keep it. To that end, the political parties, which had been repressed under the regime of the dictator General Miguel Primo de Rivera that had preceded the republic, sprung into action, sending organizers, agitators, and propagandists from the cities out into the Spanish countryside, where half the population lived in villages of fewer than 5,000 people. For many of them, this would be their first encounter with politics as a participatory exercise. For generations, political power in rural Spain, where the population consisted mostly of small subsistence farmers and landless farm laborers who worked to bring in the harvests on the estates of absentee estate owners, had been held by bosses called caciques. The jobs of these caciques was to harmonize the interests of the political parties in Madrid with those of the local landowners, dispensing patronage and threats of violence to secure the bulk vote of a population who largely suffered under what are essentially medieval social conditions. Now, the advent of mass communication in the form of film and radio, the transportation revolution of automobile travel, and the development of modern working class parties and trade unions meant that the poor of the countryside became, for the first time, modern political subjects. The Socialist Party and its affiliated union, the General Union of Workers, which in Spanish acronym is UGT, built casas de pueblos, or houses of the people, in these villages that served as organizing hubs to rival the political clubs of the landowners. Now, in these casas de pueblo, organizers showed movies, gave lectures, and coordinated labor actions. For the landowners and middle classes of the villages, this was an invasion of interlopers with heads full of French liberalism and Jewish Bolshevism, creating social conflict where before there had been placid harmony, all to the end of destroying everything good and lasting about Spain. Now, to the poor farmers and landless laborers, this was an opportunity to grasp their own destinies and assert their dignity in the face of generations of misery and oppression. Of these two perspectives, the poor one, at least, had the benefit of clarity. The comfortable lives of the professionals and propertied blinded them to the fact that Spain's future health depended above all on the reform of agriculture and land tenure. Spain depended on agricultural exports for the bulk of its economy, and Spanish agriculture was among the least efficient in Europe. If Spain continued to languish under depression conditions, the Republic would lose any popular legitimacy. Lacking capital to invest in industrial production and lacking the administrative capacity to enforce higher production at gunpoint, the government would need to boost the fortunes of the rural population to secure its future. More mechanization and efficiency in agriculture creates less need for workers, which pushes workers into industrial labor in the cities. Hypothetically, in 1931, Spain had a new, untested representative government, an economy suffering from a cycle of underdevelopment and the effects of a global depression, and violent social conflict escalating at every level of society. Meanwhile, every other so called advanced capitalist state in the world faced their own particular internal crisis brought on by the global economic collapse. For most of the 30s, the countries of Europe avoided open class warfare through electoral and military improvisation. And these improvisations brought the continent to a perfect domestic and foreign state of tension. The quote unquote Western democracies were seeing vast mobilization of workers through the electoral process, and the fascist states had suppressed their class conflict only by ratcheting up their conflict with the other states of Europe. Everyone is holding their breath for the first thread to snap. That it was Spain who broke first can be explained by Spain's specific conditions of combined and uneven development and the fundamental inability of the liberalized Spanish state to reform the basis of their economy, agriculture. Charting the road to the Second Republic, and thus to the Civil War, begins with this question. To this point, the story of the failure of Spanish agricultural reform had also been the story of the failure of the Spanish liberal project. So Spain was the first early modern European hegemon. But the elites who made up that hegemony, the military commanders who were granted royal authority over land and people in exchange for military support of the king, those people, the same ones who had first made the reconquest of Iberia and then the conquest of Latin America, would be the ones who ended up breaking that hegemony. The other powers of Europe, forced to reorient themselves to check Spanish power or be destroyed, unleashed within their own countries social forces that transformed their social structures. But there was no force within Spain that was powerful enough to challenge the authority of those local landowning elites, and the transformation to capitalism that defined Northern Europe was forcefully resisted in Spain. As a result, Spain gradually lost diplomatic and political influence until by the mid-18th century it was a second-rate power. The reformer King Charles III attempted to rouse the Spanish nobility from its self-satisfied slumber, but he was broadly defeated by the elites in the New World and the Old, who were able to effectively defend their prerogatives. It took an invasion from Napoleon's energetic, dynamic French First Empire to shock the Spanish elite into motion. Now, as resistance to French occupation grew, the struggle created leaders who saw the awesome social power unleashed by political liberalism in France, power sufficient to sweep across their borders and dominate their country. And they began working to liberalize Spain in the French model so that they would more effectively be able to compete with France and keep France from kicking their door in whenever they felt like it. But with a rural population that was illiterate and politically inert, and an aristocracy that was fat and self-satisfied, and a bourgeois that was almost non-existent, liberalism lacked a popular constituency. It would emerge within the organization that had to most suffer the consequences of this Spanish stagnation, which is the military, the guys who actually got their asses kicked by the French. And they thought liberalism was a solution to getting their ass kicked all the time. By 1820, the weakness of the central government had inspired independence movements in all the colonies of Central and South America. In Cadiz, in southern Spain, which is Spain's principal Atlantic port, officers and conscripts were mustering for deployment in the rest of colonies. Suffering the irregular pay, bad and inadequate food, and the prospect of malarial death in the jungles of the New World, the soldiers mutinied. It was from this nucleus of radicals that eventually came a demand: the institution of the liberal Cadiz Constitution that had been drafted during the French War by liberal army officers and was never recognized by King Ferdinand. French military intervention had spawned Spanish liberalism, and it was a French military intervention that squashed it 3 years after the Cadiz Mutiny, when the restored French Bourbons sent the 100,000 Sons of Saint Louis, a military formation, to overthrow the Spanish liberal government and reinstate the absolutist rule of their cousin Ferdinand. So the Cadiz Mutiny unleashes the forces of liberalism in Spain. But in so doing, it also dooms it, because it's the mutiny. It is the Cadiz Mutiny that destroys the crown's credibility in Latin America and made defending the Spanish government more and more untenable for New World elites. And so that meant that soon after the Cadiz Mutiny, the colonies were all able to affect the pretensions of their independence. Without the ability to displace exploitation onto colonial lands, liberalism could not gain social legitimacy, and the rational organs of market-based administration prized by liberals would struggle to take hold. So Cadiz dooms the Spanish Empire, and without an empire, you cannot peacefully impose liberalism on a pre-liberal's subjectivity. So the liberals get their next bite of the apple in 1833, when Ferdinand dies without male issue. He set aside the Salic law that said only sons could rule and allowed his eldest daughter Isabella to inherit the throne. And the dead king's younger brother Carlos, pointing to the tradition, disputed the succession. Naturally, around these culture war polls, the liberals ended up supporting Isabella, while Carlos led an army made up of the fiercely reactionary, small-holding peasants of Navarre, a former kingdom in its own right in the foothills of the Pyrenees bordering France. So we've talked about the exploited landless laborers of the south, but that did not define the condition of every farmer in Spain. In Navarre, you have a tradition of self-sufficient, small-holding peasants who are able to make a life for themselves on plots of land sufficient for their family to work, which means that they don't have to hire themselves out as laborers and they don't have to hire laborers. So the notion of a rural idol is real. They live the rural fantasy of what feudalism is supposed to be. And so they see liberalism as a direct challenge on a social order that to them is the very mind of God. It is God's will on earth for the world to be like that. And so it's these guys who are sort of like Spanish Spartans. They fight on behalf of God and the eternal Spanish values that they associated with their independence and prosperity, and against this godless foreign imported liberalism. And those guys are the shock troops of what becomes known as the Carlist Army, which fights a nearly decade-long war with the liberal Spanish state. So without colonies and with a stagnant quasi-feudal mode of production dominating Spanish agriculture, Isabella's liberal regime lacked the funds to fight the Carlists. There were, though, 10,000 liberal British volunteers. This is a way to remind you that at one time liberalism was a fighting faith. And one of the groups that fought on its behalf were 10,000 British liberals who were so into John Stuart Mill that they were willing to die at the end of Carlist bayonets. But they weren't sufficient, though. They weren't going to do it by themselves. To raise money and to bring market forces to bear in the countryside, the liberals finally brought the Reformation to Spain by forcing the sale of lands held by the Catholic Church and by municipalities. Now, this has the added benefit of reducing the social power of the church, which existed as an instrument of landowner dominance across the country. A mark of that power is that in exchange for allowing all these lands to be sold, the church was guaranteed continued control of education and cultural life in Spain, and the clergy were given permanent government pensions backed by government bonds. So they were essentially bought out of their share of Spanish land. The Carlist War was eventually won by Isabella's liberal forces, and after winning, they did the same thing to the Carlists that they did to the church, which was buy them out. The Carlist officer corps was absorbed into the Spanish army, and pensions were dispensed in the same way that they were to the clergy. But that transformation of Spanish agriculture they were hoping to go along with it did not follow victory. So the lands had been sold to the highest bidders, who were usually members of Spain's thin strata of bourgeois capitalists. Now, the regime had hoped that they would bring modern agricultural methods and markets to the countryside. They would bring a Protestant work ethic to the countryside and do the same thing there that had happened to the English countryside centuries earlier. But the thing is, rural Spain did not have the robust credit networks or infrastructure that would have made reinvestment in new crops and the purchase of machinery worthwhile. What it did have, though, was a huge overabundance of cheap labor. A lot of landless workers called braceros who were totally at the mercy of the landowners. So with labor that cheap, it was a much better proposition for these landowners to just act like the old landowners, which is use cheap labor do not do any improvements or innovations in efficiency and just take a bigger and bigger share of their labor. Just hyper exploit the peasantry. What's the point of investing in something where there's a limit to how much you're going to ever be able to marketize a country where market structures haven't been built? So the new landowners start acting like the old landowners. They spent the surplus created by their tenants and hired laborers on magnificent villas and inconspicuous consumption in the casinos and theaters of the provincial capitals, and in Madrid most of all. The shrinking aristocracy was able to expand itself by offering titles to these new neighbors, and the economic transformation in the countryside stalled out. But that doesn't mean that the sale of church and municipal lands didn't have a profound effect on Spain's uneven capitalist development. The Mediterranean Levant of Spain, most of the land in the regions of Catalonia and Valencia, are rich and well watered. Crops of wheat, olives, and grapes could be harvested 3 times a year some places. Medieval Catalonia had been a thriving merchant kingdom, and in the 19th century, the proceeds of wine and wheat exports helped provide investment capital for a textile industry. Industry requires labor, however, and due to the richness of the soil, Catalan farmers were relatively prosperous and happy to stay on their land, free of the domination of an employer. The sale of church and municipal lands didn't change their attitudes. But the situation was very different in the west and south of Catalonia, in the interior regions of Andalusia and Extremadura, which is an unforgiving landscape whose name derives from the Latin for outermost hard. It is a badass region which had an overproduced warrior caste who ended up making up a large number of the conquistadors of the New World, including Cortez and Pizarro, hard men making hard times in the New World. There, water was scarce, the land was parched, and many areas might see a successful harvest once every 3 years. Farmers were poor, margins of survival thin, and they were dependent on access to common lands for grazing. The sale of this land had an instant dramatic effect. The case of Seville is instructive. This capital of Andalusia had been coated in gold during the high water mark of Spanish imperial power, but the gold that didn't cover the city's domes and columns passed right through to Genoa to pay back the loans taken out by the king to fund fruitless wars of conquest and occupation. The countryside, meanwhile, languished. When church and municipal lands were sold and capitalist property relations were extended there, lands that had once belonged to 6,000 different families were concentrated into the ownership of only 400 families. Those dispossessed were forced to sell their labors to the new landowners, whose vast, disconnected estates were known in the Roman style as latifundia. There were vastly more free hands than work for them to do, so rural farm laborers, braceros, often went unemployed and unpaid for half of the year. They survived from their meager wages, odd jobs, and the proceeds of personal gardens. For those who refused this life of enforced idleness, there was another option: moving to Barcelona to work for wages in the budding textile industry. In this way, the land sales indirectly helped expand Catalonian industry by expanding the supply of wage laborers, and a rural and urban proletariat began forming in a swath of Spain running from the southwest to the northeast.
A la huelga, compañero, no vayas a trabajar.
The Spanish crown, through the institution of the Inquisition, had assiduously persecuted any hint of Protestantism under their domain. The Inquisition's members were appointed by the king, not the pope, and constituted the only nationwide extension of royal authority following the completion of the Reconquista. And they were more than happy to light up a fucking heretic. But where Martin Luther had failed, Adam Smith succeeded. With the land sales, Isabella's liberals finally began the process of liquidating the wealth and social influence of the Catholic Church, which is the start of capitalism wherever it occurs in Europe. And this is what the Carlists of the North were taking up arms to prevent. From the immiserated peasants of the South, life was marked by poverty, hunger, and the arbitrary oppression of the landowning class. Their oppression was carried out by 2 institutions that represented landowner will: the Civil Guard, a national paramilitary police force that kept a landowner-friendly version of peace in the villages, and the other, of course, the Catholic Church, whose priests used the language of God to justify the persistence of misery. The new rural and urban proletarians broke violently against the authority of the church, But since 300 years and a scientific and industrial revolution had intervened since the beginning of the Reformation, they didn't turn to the Bible to understand their new position in the world. They turned to Darwin, Proudhon, and Bakunin. In the stagnant villages of Andalusia and the teeming, decaying slums of Barcelona, a new understanding and vision of the world was emerging through the violent collective encounter between these feudal subjects and modern capitalism. What they understood was that the God of the church was a lie, a fairy tale to enforce quiescence to a regime of perfect tyranny where life existed at the whim of the employer. This arrangement had been bad enough under feudalism, but there had been a relationship between people and the land that only an act of God, not man, could sever. There were mutual chains of obligation between vassal and servant. Now the church stood by while they were thrown off the land, severed from all social ties, and into permanent subjugation, and they called it God's will. According to the church, obedience to one's masters grants a reward of eternal love and happiness in heaven. And that's a heaven that rational inquiry and collective breakthroughs of modern science show are fraudulent. But the love, the sacred presence that suffused the experience of village and family life, the laughter in the face of suffering that heaven represented on earth, that had been real. It was real and could be made real again. The native puebla, the medieval village, cooperating in harmony for the good of all, absent lying priests, thieving merchants, and thuggish landlords, was the only paradise worth seeking. This imagined horizon of a perfected rural utopia is what they squinted to see when enduring the humiliations of rural idleness and suffering the physical and spiritual exhaustion of factory labor, when they compared the past of real and imagined harmony with the discordant present they found themselves in. So, being largely illiterate and socially discombobulated, it took time and the intervention of motivated foreigners to give a shape to this new peasant faith. In 1868, a man named Giuseppe Finelli appeared in the budding textile manufacturing hub of Barcelona. He was a disciple of the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who was at that time competing with Karl Marx for preeminence in the first International Working Man's Association, which was the first attempt to create a coalition of labor groups and parties across Europe and the New World. The process of traumatic dis- and re-enchantment going on in Spain was going on all across Europe, and the association was an attempt to bring the national working class movements into cooperation with each other. Marx and Bakunin represented different approaches to the question of what is to be done by the men and women who were tasked with doing it. Marx, not coincidentally the son of a civil servant from the industrializing Rhineland of industrializing Germany, thought the workers would have to move through the political and social institutions developed by capitalism in order to transcend it. Bakunin, not coincidentally the son of noble landowners in Russia, which at this period was a still feudal and overwhelmingly rural country where the peasant village still stood as a model of potential social harmony, well, he saw these institutions as prisons to be avoided and fought against. The people would collectively and spontaneously transcend and displace the instruments of social oppression and create a free and independent association of producers. The trust and love of everyday village life used as brick and mortar to build up non-coercive mechanisms of production. Now, Marx's ideas spread among the former artisan class of the advanced capitalist states like England and Germany and France, who viewed encroaching capitalism as a threat, but possessed the skills and tools to bargain with capitalism from a position of relative strength, relative to these dispossessed peasants anyway. In the south of Spain, where Catholic monarchs, local elites, and the New World gold had stymied capitalist development, and the new proletariat was forced into an abject relationship to capital, Bakunin's message found greater purchase. And Bakunin's disciple, Finelli, who spoke no Spanish, gave French language lectures in Barcelona, and there found a ready audience for his message. Now, the first people to hear this message were the alienated and literate of the city, school teachers, students, and printers. And soon the message spread to the factory floor. Traveling prophets of what would eventually be known as the idea went from village to village like medieval friars. They told the people that the simple village contentment that wove a thread through generational memories of rural life could be the model for a whole new way of being. The state, the church, the owners, the civil guard, were only obstacles to the realization of heaven on earth. These secular saints added to their message the propaganda of their own personal decency. They generally abstained from alcohol, meat, and any kind of carnality. They lived simply and generously. Now, compared to the often illiterate, often indolent, usually drunk parish priest, the sadistic civil guards, the corrupt paper pushing bureaucrats of the state, and the vampiric bosses, these anarchist evangelists gained a social legitimacy deeper than symbols can convey. In 1872, anarchist laborers in the dry village of Alcroy then marched through the streets, parading the severed heads of the mayor and civil guard in front of them. The Spanish Reformation had its Anabaptists and its long, slow-motion peasant war. By 1873, there were 50,000 self-described Bakuninists in Spain, most of them in Catalonia. And these would form the nucleus of a movement that would come to dominate the cities and villages of both Catalonia and Andalusia. The apocalyptic anarchist horizon was best articulated by the theorist and physician Dr. Isaac Puente, whose writings would be hugely influential in the syndicalist trade movement of the 20s and 30s. Quote, "There is no need to invent anything or to create a new organization. The nuclei of the organization around which the future economic life will be organized already exist in the present society, the trade union and the free municipality. Rather than the liberal state, it was the rural municipality of ancient origin which offered a way to, quote, the solution of all the problems of coexistence in the countryside." But elsewhere in Spain, the advent of liberal modernity and the fitful course of capitalist development brought different social forms into being. West of Andalusia, in the center of Spain, the core of the old Spanish monarchy were the provinces of Aragon and Castile, Madrid being Castile's capital and the capital of Spain. In the Middle Ages, the declining fertility of that already arid region led the feudal lords of Old Castile to enclose their land and introduce sheep herds for wool export, which is pretty much what had happened in England around the exact same time, but lacking the same structures to push that process forward. All that happened in Spain was that in the short term, they boosted the riches of the landowners, drove the peasants off the land, and for the most part into the army or across the Atlantic to try their luck in the New World, but without a centralizing governing structure capable of directing those wolf profits into the rationalization of agriculture and industrial production. The sheep grazed the land dry within a few hundred years, and Castile was left parched and agriculturally unproductive. But thanks to this vent of emigration and military service absorbing the dispossessed, Castile maintained a class of roughly subsistent, poor, but crucially independent peasantry. Because they held the titles to their land, they still spiritually adhered to the Catholic Church and the idea of Spain in a way that the landless peasantry of Andalusia could not. For these peasants, crown and cross were the protectors of sacred rights, not the inflictors of their misery. Extremadura to the west was roughly similar, the trials of subsistence harder because the soil was even poorer. To the northwest, along the Atlantic coast, was the sandy, infertile region of Galicia, the last remnant of Celtic Spain, where, as in the center of the country, subsistence peasantry dominated. It was only to the east of Galicia, along the northern Atlantic coast, that Spain possessed the sufficient mineral resources to fuel any kind of industrial development. So while wine and wheat build a textile industry in Barcelona, the coal and iron of Asturias and the Basque Country built a steel and shipbuilding industry in Bilbao, the capital of the Basque province of Biscay. And so it was the Basques, a distinct ethno-religious group with their own language, which is an isolate with no known connection to any Indo-European language, became the vector for capitalist development in Iberia. So as capitalism grew in Bilbao, it created a middle bourgeois population that filled the gap left by the religious verities of feudalism with the civic destiny of nationalism. Naturally, in a kingdom that had failed to develop a strong central administration capable of breaking down linguistic and cultural barriers, this nationalism adhered to the concept of Basqueness rather than Spanishness. The Basque region had the only big bourgeois outside of Madrid, and their industrial riches funded the creation of Spain's most powerful banking fortunes, arranged in the Dutch and English style as joint stock companies. The textile firms of Catalonia, meanwhile, were all mid-sized family firms. That means that while Catalan nationalism inspired the entire rank of the Catalan bourgeois from the big to the small, Basque nationalism was confined to the smaller bourgeois and the prosperous peasants, with bankers who did business all across Spain hostile to it. Now, farther from the coast, in the Pyrenees, was the rogue Basque province of Navarre that we talked about, another medieval kingdom as Catalonia had been, filled with hardy but prosperous peasants fiercely protective of their rights and the God who consecrated those rights. They'd formed the backbone of the Carlist armies who rebelled against liberal Spain in the 1830s. Fittingly, the part of Spain that produced the first real industrial capitalist economy in Spain also produced the first organized reactionary resistance to it. Now, migrants drawn to the industrial centers of the Basque region formed the first proletarian political forms in Spain. Along with the skilled carpenters of Madrid, where the building trade was the closest thing to industry, they were the most receptive audience for the Marxist conception of working class organization that arrived on the peninsula a few years after Bakunin had. For skilled and semi-skilled workers able to extract from their employers wages above mere subsistence, the path of dialectical engagement with capitalism made intuitive sense. These people were the descendants of the artisan class as opposed to the landless peasantry, and were able to engage in labor that gave them bargaining power against their bosses. So the Marxist notion of working through institutions to overcome them made sense because they had an experience of utilizing that process. So by the 1880s, in the face of government repression, there was a national trade union, the socialist one, the UGT, and a socialist party, which had a kind of a dual party membership. If you were in one, you were assumed to be in the other. Now, the driving force behind the creation of both of these institutions was a skilled printer from Galicia named Pablo Iglesias. And it's interesting to note that the first ranks of socialist and anarchist organizers is filled with printers, whose literacy gave them access to political ideas outside the constraints of the hothouse of Spanish society, and gave them the ability to transmit those ideas to fellow workers. Now, throughout the 19th century, the liberals in Spanish government and the military had tried to push through institutional reform with an incredibly narrow social base. They had the urban bourgeois, but not the Basques or the Catalans, who were hostile to the centralizing impulse of the liberal government, and they had the leadership of the military. But the rural bourgeois saw liberalism as another invasion of godless Frenchiness, and the largely illiterate poor were unaware of and apathetic towards the machinations of a government that never seemed to impact the eternal conditions of their lives. And so liberalism stood on the bayonets of the army. This led to a pattern of cyclical political stalemate, punctuated by military coup, the result of a government lacking capacity and legitimacy to resolve conflicts. All the while, the Spanish countryside continued to languish, while uneven capitalist development caused convulsive social change in the urban areas. The coup go-around of pronunciamientos eventually claimed Queen Isabella, who was removed from the throne in 1868. Years of instability followed, and that included the short-lived First Spanish Republic and another Carlist war sparked by another military rising in Navarre. Eventually, a rough form of governing consensus was codified in the Constitution of 1876. It would be a constitutional monarchy under crowned head of Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, and it would have universal manhood suffrage, and it would have a constituent assembly named after the medieval Cortes. So the animating mind behind the Constitution of 1876, and the guy who most embodies the struggle to resolve the contradictions involved in modernizing Spain, was a conservative politician named Antonio Canovas de Castillo. So while Castillo, he's not a liberal really, because he is hostile to the overall liberal project, but he recognizes that liberals could be reconciled to a conservative monarchical regime if they were allowed access to the perks and privileges of political power. And Castillo, to that end, engineered a system known as the Turno Pacifico, or the peaceful shift. and it would define Spanish politics until well into the 20th century. And it was a coordinated and orderly cyclical transfer of power between Castillo's Conservative Party and the Liberal Party of a guy named Prajedes Mateo Sagasta. And this system was designed chiefly to divide political patronage in a peaceful fashion. And even though the 1876 Constitution codified universal manhood suffrage, the mass of the poor in rural Spain were apathetic, if not hostile, to politics. And their involvement was managed in the countryside by those local bosses, the caciques. And their methods were known as caciquismo. Caciquismo! So caciques used brute squads, which were nicknamed the Party of the Bludgeon, to wrangle votes on election day, and they negotiated amongst themselves to divide political offices and spoils, and they also acted as intermediaries between their constituents and the Byzantine governing bureaucracy that was feudally attempting to extend the modern French method of central administration to a country that was still steeped in feudal social relations. So they served a purpose for everybody. They were the middlemen of a political system that had not yet reached the grassroots. Turno Pacifico and Caciquismo succeeded at blunting the liberal-conservative conflict and ending the era of pronunciamientos. There was now more struggle between the factions within a political parties than between the parties themselves. Sometimes election results would be printed in newspapers the day before the vote. The parties maintained a vague ideological difference, with the conservatives defending the church and the landowners, and liberals seeking to empower the urban bourgeois and promote secularism. But they were also largely content to swap power and patronage on the top of a still deeply rooted system of rule that had not much changed since the Reconquest. So Turnismo solved the problem of peacefully transferring power in this low legitimacy social context, but it did nothing to resolve the burgeoning class conflict in the cities and countryside, the rising sectionalism in Catalonia and the Basque region, or the persistent crisis in the rural economy. The power of regionalism and the weakness of the center meant that the government was unable to impose free trade as a stimulant to rural and industrial development, as it did in other Western countries. Instead, the regional powers, through their network of political operatives, pursued policies of maximum protection for their specific segment of the economy. So everybody is using their regional power to pursue their regional interests to protect their spot in the hierarchy, which means there can be no creative destruction in the Schubertian sense. Instead, there's universal protectionism. Every industry gets protected. There's a tariff for everybody. And that guarded incumbent producers and failed to juice consumer demand. Without colonies and unable to raise taxes from an uncooperative landowning class, the state was at the mercy of foreign banks. As the turn of the 20th century approached, the Spanish economy resembled the economy of one of its former colonies in South America, an exporter of commodities to the West with a meager domestic market. French capital had built the railroads in Spain, and British capital had helped build the mining operations in the north. And there, the British mine engineers would swan around in pith helmets. You might think that they were in Kenya or in India. The sharp decline in Spain's power was brought into stark relief by the Spanish-American War of 1898. The awakening American giant snatched Spain's remaining colonial possessions away with shocking ease. And this was after the Spanish had spent a fruitless decade in blood and treasure struggling to repress local independence movements in the Philippines and Cuba. They essentially loosened the jar for America to just come in and pop it right open. It turns out that a military that's built mostly around kicking one group of lawyers out of a room and replacing them with another isn't always the best to fight a stand-up war. It was an army filled with bristling, stiff-necked officers of aristocratic and bourgeois background, leading ill-equipped, ill-fed peasant conscripts. Many officers in the top-heavy army pilfered material and provisions for sale on the black market. The disaster, as the Spanish-American War was known, caused some soul-searching among Spain's intellectual and political class, but, once again, the lack of a dynamic center to Spanish life prevented any of these energies from translating into reform. Instead, the Catalan ruling class became more agitated than ever to unshackle themselves from the corpse of Castile. They were being held back by all these lazy peasants in the countryside. Spain, at the turn of the century, was a country stuck between worlds. But at the level of the local village, life was a single world of outlandish poverty and obscene opulence. 2/3 of the population still lived on the land. Life expectancy was as it had been in the year 1500. With a stagnant economy, the last colonial holdings gone, with the regional bourgeois and working class agitating for power, Castillo's Turno system began to crack. The man himself was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1897. Assassinations, bombings, fitful strike action, these are the first expressions of cohering working class offensive capacity. And since it's still relatively nascent, a lot of it comes out in acts of individual, spectacular violence. So many politicians got clapped at the opera. You show up at the opera, there's a 20% chance some dude stabs you with a penknife before the ovation. For King Alfonso and the old aristocrats, for whom imperial conquests were fundamental to their conception of what Spain was, the disaster of 1898 was a profound humiliation. But luckily for them, a new opportunity to enjoy vicarious glory soon arose. French expansion in Morocco had forced Spain to secure control of the North African territory directly across from the mainland. And in 1904, Spain and France officially partitioned Morocco into zones of control, with Spain occupying the territory directly across from the Iberian Peninsula. Once again, countries are pushed into destabilizing action by the actions of their competitors. There was no capacity for Spain to occupy Morocco, but if France was going to occupy Morocco, they had to occupy the part of Morocco across from Spain, or else they would be flanked by a potential enemy. And so they committed to a spectacularly ill-advised, bloody, and protracted conflict in Morocco. But the military, defiantly unreformed after 1898, was soon predictably overwhelmed by the task set to them. But the commitment there was deepened by the fact that pretty soon they set up lucrative mining operations as well. So now sunk cost fallacy sinks in, and there's nothing to do but pour more and more resources in there. And by 1909, there are 40,000 Spanish troops in Morocco. In late July of that year, the conservative Prime Minister Antonio Maras called up a mixed brigade of active and reserve soldiers in Barcelona to deploy to put down rebellious tribes. Now, the prospect of colonial service distressed reservists who would be pulled from their jobs that supported their families. And this action appalled the rabidly anti-militarist anarchist workers of Barcelona, because one of the chief ideological tenets of anarchism is anti-militarism, disgust with the structures of military life, which were offensive to human dignity and independence. And they expressed themselves in a trade union called Solidaridad Obrera, which was inspired by the syndicalist movement in, of course, France, which is always going to serve as the prod for action in Spain. And they sought to turn the organ of the trade union itself, not the state, not political parties within the state or any state institutions, the trade union, into the social machine that would overthrow and replace capitalism. And in an echo of the liberal Cadiz mutiny of 1820, Solidaridad Obrera allied with socialists in the city to declare a general strike to resist the call-up. And what followed after the declaration of the strike was 7 days of riots, church burning, and religious grave desecration that would be remembered as the Tragic Week. Eventually, troops from outside Catalonia were brought in who could be relied on to fire on the crowds, and a blood-soaked order was restored. Over 100 civilians were killed, and 5 people were executed for incitement. One of those killed was Francisco Ferrer, the founder of the modern school movement, which sought to introduce rational inquiry to the poor, priest-haunted children of the urban proletariat. This violent event left deep impressions everywhere. The police crackdown became a scandal that brought down Marat's government. The anarchist experience helped move some of them to create the National Confederation of Labor, the CNT, an anarcho-syndicalist union that sought to organize people by craft within industries and organize from the bottom up, with authority vested in the factory sections themselves and federated outward, rather than administered downward from a central committee as the socialist trade unions were. For the conservatives, what lingered of the Tragic Week were the grisly tales of churches burned and holy grave sites desecrated, laughing young girls dancing with the disinterred corpses of nuns. It was very metal. It was a very metal week. It would be a good name for a album or a band.
Viva la FARC y la CNT, luchemos hermanos contra los tiranos y los requetés. Rojo pendón, negro color, luchemos hermanos aunque en la batalla debamos morir. Los tiempos de Rivera.
In the aftermath of the Tragic Week, Spain got its most energetic liberal government since the fall of Queen Isabella. Prime Minister Jose Canellas attempted to reduce the power of the rural caciques and took on the power of the church by limiting the growth of religious orders. And for his trouble, Canellas was assassinated by an anarchist in 1912. The short-lived Canellas experiment did have one lasting result. It provided a basis for cooperation between the liberal bourgeois parties and the socialists. Both groups fought to modernize the Spanish economy, either to fulfill the promise of capitalism or transcend it, but the class conflict inherent in that process was always going to push them apart. The thing that brought them together was that they both agreed on the need to break the social power of the large landowners and their social instrument, the church. For liberals, the church held Spain back. For socialists, it held Spain down. Either way, Spanish working class and urban bourgeois ambitions both depended on the church's role in culture to be drastically reduced. Rational inquiry was an effect of liberalism that even socialists and anarchists found useful and thought would liberate the youth of the nation and allow them to ascend new social heights. As the liberals and the left came closer over the religious issue, the right began to view both groups as different elements of a larger corrosive force destroying the country, a social contagion they referred to as anti-Spain. You guys are literally the opposite of Spain. For the Carlists of Navarre, the rural latifundists of the South, and their sons in the military officer corps, and the monarchist press, Spain, the Spain of conquest and Catholicism, was a pure and eternal thing. The endemic social unrest of the era was the product, clearly, of malign foreign influences seeking to undermine and destroy eternal Spain. The daily ceaseless pain of the poor could be heard only faintly at these heights, and thus could not be fully accounted for. What's the cause of this? Everything's great. It must be some other spirit that we must conjure. And of course, Jews, as always, figure in this theory, as they always do. But since most of the Jews had been driven out of Spain centuries before, there would have to be other more near boogeymen to be summoned. And a good one were the Freemasons. The Freemasons were mostly urban bourgeois people who were organized together to network socially and economically, and to promote the sort of secular cosmopolitan liberalism that the right associated with the godless French Republic. Freemasonry was a way to secularly meet if you were part of the generation who had been disenchanted from the church and was being re-enchanted into capitalism. And the Freemasons were a ritualistic gateway between those two worlds. And as a result, the right figures that they were secretly, because they meet in secret, controlling and directing anti-Spain towards the annihilation of Spain. And according to the right, the class violence of the anarchist workers was the result of a loss of faith that would not be ended by a changing of their conditions, but by re-Catholicizing the working class through state-enforced education and a paternalist moral reform movement. These benighted people needed to learn to love their God and their nation again. And that meant the ceaseless agitation of the secular cosmopolitan liberals had to be restrained. Shut the fuck up. You're scaring the hose. Stop talking about how God isn't real. You're freaking out these poor people. They're going to kill everybody. Unburdened by colonies, and therefore out of the European great power sweepstakes, Spain avoided the entanglements of alliances that brought the continent to general war in 1914. Interestingly, if you've ever wondered why the 1918 flu is called the Spanish flu, it's not because it started in Spain. It probably started on an army base in Kansas. It's called the Spanish flu because Spain, being the lone non-belligerent of the major countries of Europe, was the only country to not have wartime press censorship, and so was the first country to report cases of the flu, where otherwise it was being censored. So that was one result of neutrality. Another result of neutrality was a huge boom to the Spanish economy. Fortunes were made and thousands were hired to provide ships, textiles, coal, and iron to the warring parties. Declining imports from the rest of Europe forced the government to fund domestic import substitution. Migrants from poor rural districts like Murcia and Almeria flooded into Barcelona. Millions of people accustomed until extremely recently to the languid pace and intense communal ties of the country village were introduced to the rapidity and alienation of urban living overnight. Employment boomed, but inflation cut into workers' wages. Mass culture reached them in the form of movie theaters that spread across Spain like flickering mushrooms, and generated new forms of subjectivity. Infant mortality dropped, fueling a massive baby boom. So while Spain avoided fighting in World War I, though, it could only postpone the bloody social reckoning the rest of the country underwent. It could not avoid it. The social ferment that the war represented elsewhere was still happening in Spain. The rising expectations and population of the poor, the development of a mass political consciousness fueled by the war economy, the creation of new horizons of state and technological capacity, all of those could only be socially processed violently in the absence of legitimate officers were angry at low pay and irregular promotions. The Catalan nationalists were seeking autonomy, and both the socialist UGT and the anarchist CNT had their ranks swollen with new members in the wartime boom and were seeking to test their new strength. With the officers and the Catalans in an uproar, the UGT and CNT attempted to stage a general strike, the fulfillment of the syndicalist promise of revolutionary unionism. But working class institutions at this point were no more functional than any other institutions in Spain, and when those junior officers predictably turned their guns on the workers, it was only a matter of time until the strikes were broken. In Madrid, the arrest of the strike leaders ended things. In Barcelona, it took a week of street fighting. The longest holdouts were the striking miners of Asturias in the north, who were only eventually defeated with ungloved repression. News of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia hit Spain like lightning, sending electricity pulsating through the social grassroots. A bell had sounded. Somewhere, a mass of toiling workers and peasants had overthrown an oppressive monarchy, aristocracy, and church. It was possible. Redemption was at hand. In the Andalusian countryside, the years 1918 to 1920 became known as the Bolshevik Triennium, with waves of land seizures, braceros on strike, and battles with landowners and their civil guard lackeys. In Barcelona, a class war defined by strikes and lockouts spilled out into a running gun battle between anarchist militants and thugs hired by the Catalan Employers Federation. This time, which would later be called Pistolerismo, or pistol rule, saw over 800 deadly attacks on union organizers, employers, and police. The state came down hard on the CNT, jailing those of their leadership who were not shot down in the street. This decapitation of the movement left the initiative with the CNT membership, who were literally hungrier and more radical in their demands and vision. One of the things that shaped Spanish anarchism was the Employer Federation's refusal to make any accommodations to the workers, with the weak central government backing their intransigence. With no hope of carrots, the Barcelona worker felt from the state and modernity as a whole only sticks. In Madrid, 15 government ministries rose and fell between 1917 and 1921. Terrorismo had broken against the rocks of regional and class-based revolt, but no political formation could assert itself amidst the ruins. The manifest incompetence of the state extended to its last colonial outpost as well. In 1921, a buffoonish general bungled his way into a series of ambushes by Moroccan insurgents who killed 15,000 Spanish conscripts and led thousands of captive officers away in chains. At this point, conservatives, liberals, and workers were aligned on one thing. The constitutional monarchy initiated in 1876 was a failed experiment. Enter General Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Captain General of the Army in Catalonia, who revived the Spanish tradition of pronunciamiento in September of 1923. Primo de Rivera was from an aristocratic Andalusian landowning family, a veteran of the Moroccan counterinsurgency, and the military commander of the army in Catalonia. His proposition to the king, Cortes, elites, and the people of Spain was simple. It was time for this earnest political amateur to make right what generations of cynical professionals had made wrong. Unfortunately for Spain, he wasn't bullshitting. He actually was a earnest political amateur, not just pretending to be one, and he governed accordingly. Though King Alfonso once introduced him to King Victor Emmanuel of Italy as my Mussolini, Primo had neither the vision nor social base to achieve anything like fascism. His half-hearted attempt to build an official state political movement, the Patriotic Union, fizzled. His solution to Spain's problems were simple, if only fitfully effective. He extended the police crackdown on the CNT in Barcelona to the whole country until the organization was forced underground entirely. Meanwhile, though, he co-opted the more reformist socialist UGT by bringing its leader, Largo Caballero, into government and hiring socialist union officials to mediate disputes between employers and workers. But Primo could do nothing about the stagnance of Spanish agriculture or challenge the power of the rural bosses. For a while, this was masked by an economic boom that raised all boats in the early 20s, as well as a few successful government investments. Primo began a massive program of government infrastructure spending that put people to work and created a modern hydroelectric grid. He also oversaw the final victory over the Moroccan insurgents in the Rif War in 1925. But these triumphs were less impressive upon closer inspection. Unable to confront elites and raise taxes, the infrastructure projects were financed with foreign loans that fatally tipped the Spanish balance sheet. The defeat of the Rif tribesmen was only made possible by the timely intervention of the French, because the rebels had overextended themselves and attacked French territory. Economic rationalization meant handing over government export monopolies to friends and cronies like Juan March, who collaborated with Primo to turn what was a tobacco smuggling operation into a legal tobacco monopoly. Primo's was essentially a vibes-based dictatorship, and one who lives by the vibe dies by it. By 1930, the Great Depression had crippled the economy. The value of the Spanish currency, the peseta, had dropped 50% over the course of the decade. Primo had antagonized liberal and student opinion by arbitrarily intervening in the legal system, though they hadn't been bothered too much by breaking the CNT. Primo also antagonized the army by intervening in a dispute about the artillery division's promotion schedule. Seems meaningless, but when Primo asked his generals for a vibe check for his status within the army, he failed. They told him that they would not support him, and so Primo went to exile in Paris, where he promptly died, leaving Spain in need of a new governing institution.
Los cielos de España llegan sediadas, que luchan audaces por su redención. Esas altas rojas, la vanguardia son, el antifascismo que ahogará sin compasión a la bestia negra de la reacción.
The years of dictatorship had only succeeded in deepening the fault lines in Spanish society. The CNT had been effectively outlawed, but in 1927, a collection of so-called affinity groups within the anarchist movement founded a vanguard activist organization called the Iberian Anarchist Federation, or FAI. This group didn't seek to lead the masses to revolution as the Bolsheviks had, but rather to prevent the bureaucratic structures of the CNT Union from stifling the revolutionary energies of the anarchist masses. In practice, what that meant was orchestrating local conflicts with authorities, with the goal of provoking spontaneous uprisings that would eventually catch into general flames of rebellion. Meanwhile, opinion among respectable liberals and even military leaders was that the monarchy, which had indulged Primo, had outlived its usefulness. The same year, Primo de Rivera went into exile, an abortive Republican military coup illustrated how tenuous Alfonso XIII, by this point, hold on the throne was. By early 1931, liberal and student agitation drove Alfonso out of the country, and the Second Spanish Republic was soon born. Managed democracy and benign dictatorship had failed to develop Spain or soothe its social conflicts. While long-standing democracies in the rest of Europe struggled to sustain legitimacy in the face of the Depression, Spain would try to build a legitimate mass democratic government from scratch. Good luck. Dubbed the Republic of Professors for the cast of its leadership, otherwise known as the Revenge of the Nerds, the Second Spanish Republic began as an alliance of liberal Republican parties based in the urban professional classes, with the two leading figures of the Socialist Party, Largo Caballero and Indelico Prieto, both of them given ministries in the government at labor and finance respectively. The shared mandate of every element of the new regime was to break the power of the church, the landowners, and the army over Spanish life, while preventing the inherent violence of the process from overwhelming the political system. And then, as soon as they began, the churches burned. The government's response to the church burning wave of May 1931 was considered by everyone who was already skeptical of the new regime to be criminally late and half-hearted. For the Catholic right, the Republic would always bear the stain of the anti-clerical riots. So, from the Republic's first day, the stakes are set at apocalyptic. The landowners, both large and small, saw the Republic as the Antichrist, set upon dethroning God and revoking their titles of ownership. Such a fate could only be conceived of as a descent into hell, especially given decades' worth of breathless, titillated stories in the respectable bourgeois press about Bolshevik Russia, where God and deed had been abolished and blood-soaked poverty now reigned. The anarchists, who opposed the Republic, but whose organizing and agitating was allowed by it, as well as the most embittered socialists, as well as the small and growing national and regional communist parties, all spoke for those who had experienced being God's favored nation as dispossession of land, fundamentally agreed with what the right was saying. They were out to depose God and redistribute the land. But for them, it was not hell being created on earth, but heaven, in the form of the socialist project, which had materialized Christianity after the Enlightenment. The collective secular struggle for equality and justice could only be conceived as the highest form of life, especially given the decades worth of breathless, titillated stories in the respectable working class press about Bolshevik Russia, where communism had been declared and the holy work of building the workers' state gloriously continued. The attendant violence was deemed tragically necessary by the Marxists, a betrayal of freedom by the anarchists, but all agreed that Russia was the first battleground in a global class war that would soon come to their doorsteps. The liberals, the bourgeois Catalan and Basque nationalists, academics, journalists, lawyers, professionals, who represented those who tended to have no particular emotional relationship to the land, one way or the other, who instead tended to work with symbols, insisted that this whole framework was hysterical nonsense. The Republic didn't stand for anything like that. Yes, the power of the church needed to be curbed, but only to allow for enlightened modern education to transform illiterate peasants into productive workers. Don't you want productive workers? They could contribute their intellect to their employer's bottom line. Everybody wins. They could boost Spain into the ranks of developed nations, where the spoils of development could be distributed, if not equally, then rationally. Yes, the land would have to be redistributed, capital investment in mechanization would have to be compelled, but that was only to advance the greater goal of a developed modern Spain. For the liberals, comfortably adjacent to the mutually reinforcing agonies of master and servant, the value of sacrificing immediate interests for the greater project of creating modern Spain was self-evident. But for those who struggled every day to ignore the rising protest of their stricken conscience on the one hand, or their rumbling stomachs on the other, a sterile talking house Spain, where real conflict was diffused into wind, was a dire prospect even if it wasn't delusional. Trading dignity for safety until both had disappeared was a fate worse than death. Much better to suffer exquisite extinguishment in the existential combat, which promised an end to suffering just as certainly as victory did. Now, the plummy British academics who dominate the English language historiography of the Spanish Civil War have a very hard time hiding their sympathies for the liberals, who they clearly see as the lone sane faction during this period, trying heroically to steer a nation of gibbering reactionaries and unhinged radicals towards the shores of modern democratic capitalism. In this view, stated or unstated, modern democratic capitalism is simply the process of a nation coming to its senses. Now, from the placid shores of England, that logic is unimpeachable. There, the bloody work of imbuing deliberative governing structures with popular legitimacy had occurred at the head of the serpent of European capitalist development, not the tail. In England, the even bloodier work of building and maintaining a global system of commodity exchange, sufficient to buy off the keenest edge of landowner guilt and proletarian hunger, allowed real political conflict to express itself in colonial massacres and famines, nothing in the heartland. You get to have your precious parliament and have your votey votes in the metropole. But Spain had no colonies, had lost her colonies. Her commodity exchange network was paltry. The brutal class war spurred by fear and hunger raged inside of her, not in far-off colonies. With economic depression racking the land and no internal system able to reform Spain's political economy from within, time would show which faction of Spanish politics was actually detached from reality. On a hot night in July, the 18th, 1936, anarchist dock workers boarded the prison ship Uruguay while it sat in the port of Barcelona. The prisons were the singularly most repulsive institution to the anarchist spirit. Anarchist adventurists like Buenaventura Durrudian, and Francisco Ascaco had repeatedly attacked the Uruguay with bombs and bullets over the years. But this night was not a raid or a jailbreak. The CNT activists were on the Uruguay to liberate not the prisoners, but the guards' weapons. Because in Spanish Morocco, the army had seized control and declared its intention to overthrow the republic. There were rumors that Seville had been taken as well, and that the garrisons of Madrid and Barcelona would rise in the morning. If they were to avoid destruction, the CNT workers of the city needed all the guns they could get their hands on. The news had filtered into Barcelona throughout the 18th of July. Confused radio announcements, newspaper articles, telephone calls from relations elsewhere in the country. Spanish Morocco had fallen first, and now civil guard and armed right-wing civilians on the mainland were joining forces with military units to arrest representatives of the left-wing Popular Front government and union leaders. For the moment, however, the various army barracks of Barcelona were silent, but throbbing with quiet menace. Luis Companys, the president of the Generalitat, the annoyingly named Catalonian autonomous regional government. I know it was what you called yourself in the Middle Ages, but it sounds annoying to say. Just call it the General something. I don't care. The General House, the Generalitat. I'm sick of it. President of the Generalitat was a good liberal lawyer who had defended anarchists pro bono during the years of pistol rule that followed World War I. But now, faced with the prospect of arming the CNT to distributing weapons to the workers of the city to put down a rebellion, he balked. The only thing scarier to the bourgeois leaders of the Catalan government than the prospect of a military coup was the prospect of an anarchist revolution. So the CNT used their radio station to announce a general strike to begin the next day, and CNT defense committees set out that night to take destiny and weapons into their own hands. Military armories guarded either lightly or by sympathetic enlisted men were raided. The jailers on the Uruguay were relieved of their arsenal. Gun shops were stripped bare. A shipment of dynamite laying in a docked freighter was expropriated and turned into makeshift hand grenades. Welders fused metal sheeting to the side of trucks and taxicabs to create makeshift armored cars. Across the city, paving stones, rolls of newsprint, and sandbags were stacked into makeshift barricades. The sleepless textile workers, printers, barbers, students, and school teachers of Barcelona tensed for sunrise. The fate of the city, the country, the human race would be decided in the morning. Cataclysms like the Spanish Civil War send shockwaves through time, both forward and backward. The declaration of the Second Spanish Republic in 1931 had established civil war as an existential inevitability. An underdeveloped agricultural economy in the middle of a global depression was not going to be turned into a modern capitalist state through points of parliamentary procedure. No European country that lacked significant colonies made the transition to modernity peacefully, and Spain would not be an exception. For 5 years, the people of Spain, latifundists to braceros, magnates to mechanics, were subtly but forcefully aligned towards open civil conflict, like iron filings drawn into battle order by the great magnetic spike of war lodged in their collective future. The riots and church burnings that had accompanied the establishment of the Second Republic in May of 1931 were a dark omen, but the liberals and reformist socialists of the new government set about undaunted to the task of rewriting the Spanish Constitution. Their agenda was bold. The land, the army, and the church would each be transformed, and with them, Spain. The church was their first target, looming large as it did over Spanish life, relatively inexpensive to tackle, and uniting the otherwise quarrelsome liberal Republicans and Marxist socialists in their mutual resentment of the institution. So, Articles 26 and 27 of the new Republican Constitution ended Catholic influence over Spanish education and public spaces. The Jesuits were banned, by the way, not for the first time in the history of Spain. Charles III had also banned their asses in the 18th century. They are always annoying to everyone. That's the Jesuits. The state stipend for clergy, which had existed for 100 years, was sunset. Now, this was significant in a country with well over 100,000 priests, nuns, and monks running around. Those funds would be shifted to build thousands of secular schools and raise pay for secular school teachers. This is the culture war erupting into modernizing Spain. For the right, these reforms were nothing less than the repetition of Christ's crucifixion. Coming as they did after the state's desultory response to the church burnings in May, the church reforms marked the Republic as fundamentally antagonistic to traditional Spanish religious life. Anti-Spain in power. In July, two top Spanish prelates, a cardinal and a bishop, who walked into a bar and then had persisted in condemning the government and extolling the fallen monarchy, were exiled to France. And in Navarre, the smallholding peasants whose ancestors had fought and lost multiple wars against liberalism on behalf of the Carlist pretender to the throne and the Catholic Church unearthed their grandfathers' red berets, which were the symbols of the movement, and began to stir again into political action. Meanwhile, War Minister Manuel Azana set about the task of cleaning the Augean stables of the Spanish military. The army was bloated and top-heavy, with one officer for every 11 soldiers and a general for every 1,200, often a make-work program for the non-inheriting sons of the rural landowning class. Military expenditures made up 18% of the Spanish budget, but 60% of that went to officers' salaries, leaving the army itself chronically under-equipped. War Minister Azana went about slashing the officer corps by offering full pensions to all who chose to retire and demanding all who remained in active service to swear an oath of loyalty to the Republic. Over 5,000 officers took the buyout. Azana also reduced the number of army divisions on the peninsula and abolished 3 military academies, including one in Zaragoza under the direction of a Brigadier General Francisco Franco, who might come in later to the story. Military judicial authority was curtailed, and to balance out the civil guard, which was seen as a tool of the rural landowners who were most hostile to the Republic, the government established a new paramilitary police force, the Assault Guard. The cuddly named Assault Guard would be concentrated in cities rather than in the countryside, and ideally be staffed by officers more loyal to the Republic. These reforms succeeded in shrinking the army, but didn't make it any more institutionally loyal to the Republic. Many liberal officers took the pensions to get out of a stubbornly reactionary institution that resisted meaningful reform. The right-wing officers who took pensions retired to complain and scheme against the Republic. Those who remained complained and schemed on the clock. For the officer corps, the army was Spain, and Azana's reforms compromised the army's authority and autonomy. It didn't help that Azana, who is a career journalist and man of letters, spoke of pulverizing the army. And this was after he had excused the government's slow response to the church burnings in May by saying that all the churches in Spain weren't worth a single Republican life. These gaffes didn't prevent Azana from becoming prime minister, though, when the new Republican Constitution was ratified in October. And for all the Sturm und Drang that accompanied church and army reform, it was agrarian form that would decide the fate of the Republic. Its first fruits were laws that restricted rural evictions and banned landowners from hiring laborers from outside of their municipality. This was to prevent the importation of cheaper migrant labor and increase the negotiating power of the local braceros. Now, the owners howled at this infringement of their sacred rights of property and contract, and they argued that it forced them to hire incompetent locals over skilled outsiders. But the measure's effect on rural poverty was dramatic and instantaneous. Wages for farm laborers doubled between 1931 and 1933, propelling a massive influx of peasants into the Socialist Party and the agricultural section of the UGT Socialist Union. The farm laborers tended to prefer anarchism, but the rapid wage increases and eviction protections were the first taste of meaningful political reform in their lifetimes. Suddenly, politics felt like a place that they could be represented. Soon, there were 500,000 braceros in the Socialist UGT Union, bringing with them the deep hunger, pain, and resentment of poor rural existence, which had until then had mostly found an outlet in the anarchist C&T trade union.
A la huelga, compañero, no vayas a trabajar. deja quieta la herramienta, que es la hora de luchar a la huelga.
Now, for all their immediate effect, these reforms were still only ameliorative measures. Real agrarian reform would require redistribution, rationalization, and reinvestment. The good old 3 R's. We love them. It was this question, as well as the question of Catalan autonomy, that dominated the deliberations of the Cortes in the first half of 1932. Because, as I said, Catalan politics at this point are dominated by a left bourgeois party, an alliance of peasants and the middle class in the cities. And they were a hugely important part of the overall Republican coalition. And so making them happy was key to the long-term success of the Republic. So like everything else in Spain, the Catalan bourgeois was divided. They all supported autonomy, but the large textile owners, small compared to the Basque industrialists and financiers, were otherwise as staunchly Catholic and reactionary as the Castilian-speaking right. But as I said, by 1932, Catalan politics was dominated by the Esquerra, which is Catalan for left party. And that's small bourgeois, the small-holding dead vine peasants who owned their land, but only at the sufferance of a medieval right to harvest near the dead vines of larger estates. And it was their constant conflict with the large landowners that sharpened their politics to the left. And it also got votes from a lot of non-anarchist workers in Barcelona, as well as the anarchist workers who did vote, even though the CNT said don't do that. A lot of them still did. And when they did, they voted for the Esquerra. And now the Esquerra wanted their demands met, which is Catalan autonomy, their own ability to make local laws and spend local revenues. Now, to the right, specifically the officer corps of the army, who had spent years fighting a domestic counterinsurgency in the streets of Barcelona, and, by the way, whose budgets were partially dependent on Catalan tax revenues that were going to be lost with autonomy, for them, any such devolution of power was a grievous insult and another rent in the fabric of eternal Spain. All of this and more were too much for General José Sanjurjo, the commander of the Civil Guard. Now, Sanjurjo was from Navarre. He was the son of a Carlist general who had fought in the rebellion against the First Republic in the 1870s, before he was, of course, absorbed into the victorious military like the rest of the Carlist officer class. Now, Sanjurjo made an impressive career carrying out imperial and domestic counter-guerrilla warfare. He fought against rebels in Cuba before the Spanish-American War and gained the nickname the Lion of the Rif for his part in the defeat of the Rif tribesmen of Morocco in 1925. Sanjurjo had been the general who told King Alfonso in 1930 that his support in the army was too weak to continue. By 1931, he was exercising his counter-guerrilla methods domestically as chief of the Civil Guard. All while the rising expectations generated by the new government led to increased social conflict in the countryside. That winter saw high unemployment for braceros in Andalusia and Extremadura, and in December, a demonstration of UGT-aligned farm workers in the village of Castilblanco erupted in violence that left 4 civil guardsmen dead. In January, the Civil Guard unleashed a wave of reprisal violence against striking peasants, culminating in a massacre of 15 civilians in Arendo in the north of Spain. Under massive public pressure, Azana removed Sanjurjo from command of the Civil Guard and moved him to command of the Carboneri, Spain's border and customs police force. Sanjurjo began plotting with aristocratic Carlist civilians to overthrow the Republican government. In August, in Seville, Sanjurjo made his pronunciamento, insisting that he sought to end the godless government of Azana, not the Republic. But the times had passed by the line of the Rif, and the heavily politicized, easily mobilized working class of Spain sprung into action. Sanjurjo's allies in Madrid were dispersed in a farcical brawl. Apparently, Azana watched it happen from his balcony while smoking a cigarette. And in Seville itself, a joint CNT-UGT general strike broke the coup's momentum. Sanjurjo fled to be apprehended by Republican forces near the Portuguese border. And it was in the outraged aftermath of this botched coup that Azana's government was able to pass a statute for Catalan autonomy and agrarian reform. To punish the aristocracy, who were widely assumed to have been complicit in the coup, even if many of them had no idea what was happening, the punitive expropriation of noble lands was tacked on. By 1932, only 6% of the land in Spain was owned by the aristocracy. So formal expropriation was an insufficient basis for redistribution. Another provision of the law limited the amount of land a single owner could hold. All told, the reforms ended up freeing up enough land to settle about 60,000 farming families, which amounted to a spray of drops in the million-man ocean of landless Spanish braceros. Over 10 million hectares of land would have to change hands at gunpoint to accommodate the whole landless rural population. In addition to being insufficient, the reform was resisted at all points by the rural landowners. In the countryside, many of the political officials of the new regime were the same power-broking caciques of the days of the monarchy. One rural worker recalled a landowning family whose 3 sons were each members of a different Republican political party. Much of the land given to braceros was the least productive available. Compounding matters was the general poverty of the Spanish government. The new constitution included Spain's first income tax, but depression conditions killed demand for Spanish agricultural exports. Capital flight was another concern. A $60 million loan from J.P. Morgan that had been arranged in the last days of the monarchy was canceled as soon as the Republic was inaugurated. The richest Spaniards began sending their money out of the country. A promised agrarian bank that was supposed to provide cheap loans for the purchase of seed and modern farming machines was never established. The result was landless peasant families settled on marginal soil without access to the capital necessary to improve it. The countryside, where poverty and unemployment were double what they were in the cities, exploded with pain and rage. Rising expectations created by the first round of reform and frustration at the pace of progress was catalyzed by the increased mobilization capacity created by mass union membership. This generated a new militancy among the braceros of the South, a new sense of empowerment, and the awkward situation for the Republican coalition government, in which the ministers of labor and finance were members of the Socialist Party. These were men who were authorizing the violent breaking up of strikes and demonstrations by the very landless workers they claimed to represent. Now, this contradiction solidified the view among the anarchists that the state could never be an instrument of working class liberation. The anarchist peasants of the South responded to the advent of the Republic with periodic rebellions, which were called revolutionary gymnastics both by sympathizers and critics within the anarchist movement. The sympathizers with revolutionary gymnastics were embodied by the activities of the Anarchist Federation of Iberia, which in Spanish letters is the FAI. Very important. The FAI, folks. It's the ideological and militant vanguard of the anarchist movement. The FAI, which had been founded in the depths of the Rivera dictatorship's repression. It was a collection of affinity groups of often around a dozen activists, cells, if you will, dedicated to the idea that the anarchist revolution would come from the spontaneous action of the Spanish people, not from any political formation. The FAI existed to direct and inspire the actions of the people. The archetypal anarchist of this mold was the previously mentioned Buenaventura Durruti of the Nostromo group, which was the name of his cell, a career militant who had directed insurgent attacks against the Primo de Rivera regime and committed revolutionary bank expropriations in Latin America. Now, the critics of these cyclical explosions of popular resentment were known as the Trentistas, which were named after the 30 signatories of a 1931 statement which told the anarchists, look, guys, I know we all love doing illegal stuff, but the only real way we're going to change stuff is if we use political power and union organizing. That only through building structures of power can we pursue the seizure of power. Now, this pissed the shit out of the old school anarchists, and these Trentistas, the 30 signatories, and tens of thousands of their followers were formally expelled from the CNT. Get this shit out of here. We don't want any of your fucking political parties. We don't want any of your, even labor unions. We want spontaneous action of the workers to reform organically society and not be tainted by the authoritarian implications of the structures that you're talking about. We don't want to lose our love. We can't lose our love for each other by being subsumed to the dead hand of this discipline. Now, these people who were expelled ended up forming, some of them, a syndicalist party, an attempt to turn anarchism into a political movement, but it never really got anywhere in Catalonia. But these debates were ornamental to the unbreakable dynamic of a deeply poor, deeply resentful peasantry facing an economic depression and exploding political horizons. No matter what the eggheads in the anarchist movement thought about revolutionary gymnastics, They were an inevitable byproduct of the social conditions in the Spanish countryside in the south. They were not going to be able to make them happen or make them stop. For the first time, amongst this incredibly oppressed population, the world actually felt malleable and up for the taking. It felt like the growling of the stomachs that was more intolerable with each passing day could be silenced through action. CNT or FAI, the leaders of the anarchist movement, were forced to react in the aftermath of spontaneous peasant risings and strikes. Their lack of an ability to coordinate their grassroots with their leadership doomed every one of these explosions to a violent extinguishment because they could not be harnessed together to be wielded against the state.
Viva la FAI y la CNT, luchemos hermanos contra los tiranos y los requetés. Rojo pendón, negro color, luchemos hermanos aunque en la batalla debamos morir.
So this leads to the anarchists essentially forming something like a permanent insurgency within the Second Republic, a constant frothing, illegal war while the formal mechanisms of politics continued on. This low-level war between CNT farmers and the civil guard in the countryside saw deaths on both sides, culminating in the Casa Viejas incident. Now, in the Andalusian village of Casa Viejas, a standoff between anarchists and civil guard ended with the civil guard massacring 24 CNT militants and their family members. Outrage from the rank and file of the socialist and anarchist movement boiled upwards at the government. Even the right wing cynically accused President Zamora and Prime Minister Azana of having blood on their hands. The scandal and general failure to advance beyond the gains of the first 2 years of the Republic bled support from the government and fueled internal strife throughout 1933, which was the worst year of the Depression in Spain. Now, in September, a dispute between the Socialist Party and one of the main Republican parties supporting the government brought down Azana's ministry, and new elections were called for. The liberals and socialists had claimed victory in 1931, in part due to the fracture of the Spanish right, existing as it did as a collection of regional parties organized around regional economic interests, and all of them hostile to the very idea of representative government. Now, 2 years of dramatic government reforms and rising labor militancy had the dual effect of driving the liberals and left apart while drawing the regional right together. In March of 1933, representatives of regional right parties, spearheaded by Popular Action, a Catholic populist group modeled after Action Française across the Pyrenees, there it goes again, every single time the French have an innovation, the Spanish copy it, met to form an electoral coalition. The result was the Spanish Coalition of Autonomous Rights, or CEDA, C-E-D-A, funded by the country's landowners and led by José María Gil Robles, a lawyer and son of a Carlist legal theorist. CEDA brought the often fractious local barons of Spain together around a national platform of belligerent Catholic nationalism, denouncing the first 2 years of the Republic as a descent into a godless Marxist maelstrom. For their part, the Socialist Party embraced radical militancy in its election platform, demanding the nationalization of the land, the dissolution of all religious orders, and the seizure of their property, as well as the dissolution of the army and the civil guard to be replaced by people's militias. The new Spanish Constitution rewarded coalitions, and the election in November saw a coherent right coalition in CEDA run against a Republican, liberal, and socialist left that were falling away from each other. This was also, by the way, the first Spanish election to allow votes for women. And the female population, which was generally more pious and church-going than the male, disproportionately supported the militantly Catholic CEDA. The results of the election were a massive win for CEDA, which was the single biggest vote-getter in the country. But the president of the Republic was still a good liberal, Niceto Zamora, and he refused to allow a government headed by Gil Robles to be formed. It's the old Popper's tolerant intolerance problem. Do you let into government people who would destroy your government? Gil Robles was a loud opponent of the secular reformism that was the sine qua non of representative government to guys like Zamora. CEDA was denied any ministerial posts in the new government, and the prime ministership passed to Alejandro Lerroux of the Radical Party. So at the turn of the century, 30 or so years ago, Lerroux led a group of young barbarians, he called them, which were working-class roustabouts who he put to war against the church and the monarchy. He was the essentially right populism of turn-of-the-century Barcelona. He captured all of the non-anarchist workers in a general anti-clerical thuggery. That's why he called them young barbarians. But it was proto-fascist opportunism. And by the 30s, LaRue's party was an ideologically vacant collection of machine hacks because it had always just been a way to gain power. Hey, what do these guys hate? The church? I'll help them hate the church and the king. And I'll give them power and I'll let them smash some windows. And then they won't start thinking about overthrowing the government, and they'll maybe give me some political power within it. And it was funded by the corrupt Primo-era monopolists like the tobacco millionaire Juan March. Conflict between the socialists and radicals had brought down Azana's government, and now LaRue and his followers were happy to front for a right-wing government of monarchical Catholic nationalists in exchange for access to political spoils and patronage. LaRue's government was made all the more galling by the facts that the vagaries of the Constitution meant that 800,000 radical votes had translated to 104 seats in the Cortes, while 1.6 million socialist votes had netted only 61 seats. I love to net 61 seats. This radical fig leaf did little to quiet the unease on the left at the rise of SEDA. The situation in the rest of Europe only deepened the anxiety. In March of 1933, Hitler's government in Germany passed the Enabling Acts and began the process of destroying leftist opposition to the Nazi regime. In the same month in Austria, the diminutive Austro-fascist Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who advocated a Catholic corporatist government very similar to SEDA's program, exploited a parliamentary crisis to abolish Austrian democracy. Now, as 1934 dawned, the Catholic corporatists of SEDA were poised to reverse the reforms of the first 2 years of Republican rule and perhaps abolish the Republic itself. Now, returning into power, the landowners who financially backed SEDA acted as the restored French Bourbons had, by forgetting nothing and learning nothing. General San Giorgio, whose death sentence had been commuted to a 30-year prison term as an olive branch to the right, was pardoned and allowed to enter exile in the neighboring right-wing dictatorship of Portugal. Agrarian reform was halted and the municipal law reversed. Employers began assembling blacklists of known socialist workers to ban from future employment. Rural wages plummeted. This was the start of what would be later known by the left as the 2 black years of reactionary rule, made even worse by collapsing economic conditions caused by the continuing global depression. Britain and France enacted protectionist policies that destroyed Spain's agricultural export market. Foreign trade fell 70% from 1931 to 1935. The Latin American countries where Spaniards had emigrated for generations closed their borders and repatriated Spanish immigrants. Factory closures in the cities, some of which were politically motivated, sent urban migrants back to their home villages. So at the very moment that subsistence was hardest to come by in the countryside, the pressure valve of emigration reversed. There were more mouths to feed and fewer jobs in the countryside than ever. The Socialist Party newspaper claimed, "Never, not even in the worst days of the monarchy, did the peasants feel more enslaved and wretched than now." Socialist Party journalists could write about the enslaved wretchedness of the braceros of southern Spain, but it was another thing altogether to experience it in your day-to-day life. The cumulative agony of the landless peasants drove the Socialist Party into chronic internal conflict and hindered coordinated political action. Over the summer of 1934, Largo Caballero, the ascetic former plasterer and leader of the more radical faction of the socialists, moved to build a workers' alliance of proletarian parties and unions, from the communists to the CNT. The liberal Republicans would never take extra-parliamentary action against the government, but the Marxists and anarchists could. But while the unions and parties that represented the interests of the urban and rural workers met to negotiate terms of cooperation and reacted to political developments in the Cortes, the actual suffering braceros, languishing on 2.5 pesetas a day, took action on their own terms. It was always difficult to keep hungry laborers and well-fed union officials on the same page, but the deep economic and social crisis of 1934 broke the connection between the rural rank and file and union leaders. The social and political isolation of the braceros in the villages was total. In the cities, many small bourgeois and professionals had liberal politics and believed themselves to be on the side of the workers in some sense. But in the countryside, social life was deeply bifurcated. Professionals, like big landowners, wore ties and shoes, not straw hats and sandals. They, like the big landowners, lived in houses, not flea-ridden barracks. The only way for the suffering braceros to breach the social divide was through militant labor action. The only way to get the attention of the other side was through violence. And in the summer of 1934, strikes and demonstrations popped off across southern Spain as particular local conditions sparked particular local responses. General strikes flared in Valencia and Zaragoza. The working class unions and political parties were unable to coordinate responses to these actions, and one by one they were crushed by the landowners and the civil guard. By the fall of 1934, militancy among the 500,000 rural UGT members had been momentarily broken, at the precise moment that CETA provoked a political crisis that would finally push Caballero's Workers' Alliance into action. Gil Robles saw a violent conflict with the left as inevitable. Sooner or later, he said, we would have to face a revolutionary coup. It would always be preferable to face it from a position of power before the enemy was better prepared. And to this end, Gil Robles engineered a series of provocations. He had taken his honeymoon in Nuremberg to witness Nazi rallies, and he brought that staging and drama to Spain. Supporters would march past him giving stiff-armed salutes and calling out Jefe. At a rally for the CETA Youth Division, featuring thousands of peasants paid to attend and bussed in by political bosses, Gil Robles declared, "We are an army of citizens ready to give our lives for God and for Spain. No one can stop us from imposing our ideas on the government of Spain." It was widely understood that the left's red line would be the inclusion of CETA members in the governing cabinet. And on October 4th, 1934, Gil Robles used his influence as leader of the largest party in the Cortes to insist on 3 CETA ministerial positions, one of them a prosecutor who had ordered the confiscation of thousands of copies of the socialist newspaper. So, at the moment when grassroots worker energy in the countryside was most broken and dispirited, the Workers' Alliance launched a tepid general strike in Madrid with the goal of forcing President Zamora to call new elections. At the same time, a separate political crisis flared in Catalonia, where the Generalitat, still controlled by Companys and the left Esquerra, had their own agrarian reform laws stricken down by the central judicial authority. A radical faction of Catalan nationalists, who were the closest thing the Catalan bourgeois ever came to fascism, forced Companys' hand, and a Catalan republic was declared. Now, both of these movements in Madrid and Barcelona lacked support from the toiling masses. The rural section of the UGT had exhausted itself over the summer and provided little support for the general strike. The CNT in Barcelona had no more respect for a Catalan state than a Castilian one and stood aloof from the independence push. In Madrid and Barcelona, government forces were able to suppress the insurgencies with relative ease. But there was one place where the local conditions and organizations came together to create a serious, sustained challenge to the central government. Asturias, on the north-central Atlantic coast, was the center of Spanish mining. The miners of Asturias were among the best-paid laborers in the country and the most well-organized, with both the UGT and CNT represented in the workforce. Years of struggle against the mine owners on questions of employment and workplace safety had given the socialist and anarchist unions, constantly in conflict with each other in the rest of Spain, ample opportunity to cooperate. The lack of large landowners in Asturias meant that there was no restive class of hyper-exploited migrant braceros in the countryside accelerating conflict. Anarchist and socialist miners in Asturias made the Workers' Alliance a reality, where everywhere else it had been a fantasy. Only there did the entry of CETA into the government have the effect of galvanizing the entire working class into action, because it wasn't responding to specific conflicts, because there was a general well-being. There was no hyper-exploited class here. Everybody has a paycheck or they're unemployed within that class. So they can wait for a political spark to mobilize around and act around instead of being forced to always respond after a conflict has already been initiated. The Workers' Alliance in Asturias were certain of one thing. Spain would not be allowed to go the way of Italy, Germany, and Austria. The working class of Spain would not go without a fight. As the UGT and CNT moved towards a rising, they met resistance from an unlikely source, a small but well-organized group of Asturian communists. Through the summer of 1934, the Asturian communists refused to join any plans to rise against the government. But when it became clear that the UGT and CNT miners were dead set on acting if CETA took power, they went along. This sort of tracks with the way Marx treated the Paris Commune. You don't want them to do it, but once they go for it, you have to go along, or else you have betrayed the will of the workers. On the 4th of October, the miners set down their tools and picked up their rifles, many of which had been smuggled into Asturias over the course of the summer by Indelico Preto, the leader of the moderate wing of the Socialist Party. Preto will always zig when you think he's going to zag. Uttering the slogan, HUP, which stood for UHP, or Unite Proletarian Brothers, they seized public buildings in the Asturian capital of Oviedo, imprisoned leading rightists, and declared a workers' government. The mines and arms factories were taken over. Money was abolished and replaced with ration coupons. Dynamite used in mining was turned into weapons of war. The previously reluctant communists put yeoman's work into the cause. Soon, the entire region was in the hand of the workers, and the local army and civil guard were powerless to stop them. The Spanish Civil War is often referred to as the dress rehearsal for World War II. If that's the case, then the October 34 Asturian uprising is the dress rehearsal for the dress rehearsal. A dynamic was established there that would be repeated 2 years later. Spanish colonial mercenaries brought to the mainland to break the power of the working class. Now, knowing that the underpaid, under-equipped, low-morale Peninsular Army stood little chance against the highly motivated and well-armed Asturian miners, the central government authorized the deployment, for the first time, of colonial Moroccan forces in Spain. While the Peninsular Army was a collection of time-serving bureaucrats relaxing on top of a groaning mass of insolent peasant conscripts, the army in colonial Morocco was a different beast altogether. In 1920, the Spanish had created their own foreign legion on the French model to better dominate their Moroccan possessions. Once again, they're out constantly copying off the frog's paper. But while the French Foreign Legion offered French citizenship to tramps and criminals from around the world in exchange for service, the Spanish Foreign Legion was mostly made up of Spanish citizens who were looking for a steady paycheck or an alternative to prison. Their slogan was Viva la Muerte, long live death. And for 16 years, they have been the tip of the spear of the Spanish colonial project in Morocco. The other military units in Spanish Morocco were made up of mercenary Rif natives, who, having been defeated by the combined efforts of Spain and France, said, if you can't beat them, join them, and signed up to fight for their colonial masters. These troops were known as regulares, in contrast to the Moroccan irregulars, who continued to resist European colonial authority. Faced with the resolute defiance of the Asturian miners, the central government deployed foreign legionnaires and Moroccan regular mercenaries under Generals Francisco Franco, late of the Zaragoza Military Academy, and Manuel Godet to Asturias to crush the rebellion. Over the next 2 weeks, Franco and Godet's legionnaires and regulares, augmented by bombs dropped by the nascent Spanish Air Force, slowly ground down the Asturian rebellion. For 14 days, the African forces slugged it out with the CNT-UGT miners. Eventually, the miners surrendered on the condition that the Moroccans not be the first soldiers into the town. This conflict, workers' militias against air and ground power with the colonial occupying army, would be repeated 2 years later. Deaths on both sides came to around 2,000, and incidents of summary execution, rape, and torture defined the government conquest. Right-wing press reports decried the executions of priests and right-wingers during the occupation and demanded severe punishment for the rebellion's leaders. While the liberals and national left parties had stood by during the destruction of radical Asturias, they rallied to the cause of amnesty and exoneration for the imprisoned leadership of the rebellion. Typical. The liberal and socialist leadership were like, look, we do not want you to rebel against the government. But once it's over, they will say that they should be freed and exonerated, because that is a demand that the system can hold. It's always easier for liberals to embrace revolution after it's been safely neutralized. The Asturias Rising became the psychic fulcrum of politics for the remainder of the Second Republic. No one on either side of Spanish politics believed afterward that democratic governments could persist in the long term. Either the left would seize power and expropriate the landowners, or the right would drive the liberals out of the halls of power and break the working class once and for all. In the immediate aftermath, between 20,000 to 30,000 leftists were arrested around the country, including Manuel Azana, Largo Caballero, and Luis Campañas. Preto, that wily little boy, had fled to France before the Asturias Uprising. Largo took his time in prison to finally read for the first time in his life the works of Lenin and Marx. The socialist Casas de Pueblos were closed, and the government debated whether to ban the Socialist Party and UGT entirely. But even with this crackdown, the government failed to do what Hitler or Dollfuss had done and used the crisis to abolish democracy. While Gil Robles and the SEDA flirted with fascist iconography and ritual, their political project was fundamentally conservative. They were happy to use the powers of government to suppress their enemies without risking a fatal institutional rupture. Spain did have a fascist party, the Falange, which had been formed out of a merger of two smaller fascist groups in 1933 and was led by the dapper son of the former dictator, José Antonio Primo de Rivera. Primo held the Falange's only seat in the Cortes, and the membership in 1935 sat in the low thousands. The Falange held some appeal to bourgeois students and resentful service workers in Madrid, but it had no mass base. Because Spain had been neutral in World War I, it lacked the huge numbers of brutally traumatized combat veterans who filled the ranks of fascist movements elsewhere in Europe. Even the Spanish variant of fascism was less radical than elsewhere. For one thing, it was much more oriented towards the Catholic Church. Otherwise, Falange policy was the same half-witted dog's breakfast of reactionary anti-capitalism and social hysteria typical of Carlism, only with a blue shirt instead of a red beret. But Gil Robles spent 1935 using the institutions of the Republic to advance a broadly reactionary agenda that the left saw, in the zero-sum context of the continued depression, as an existential threat. Just as the liberal left government had finally brought the regional right-wing movements into national coalition, the actions of the radical/SEDA government had the same effect for the liberals and left who had drifted apart while in power. In March 1935, Manuel Azaña, having been released from prison without charges, headlined a rally in Madrid. Before 300,000 people, he made an eloquent argument for liberal left political unity. Azaña was aided in his quest by a dramatic change in Communist Party policy. Spain's Communist Party had been formed in the 1920s by dissident leftists who viewed the Soviet Union as the headquarters of global Marxist revolution. The early communists were the most motivated and the youngest members of the socialist movements, the ones who were most emotionally offended by capitalism, the ones who were most insistent on having a cause to follow, who most emanated the emotional energy that would once have gone into religious orders. It was those people who saw the Bolshevik Revolution as the millennium and sought to bring it about in Spain. It attracted young, highly motivated activists who fully embraced the discipline and purpose that came with submission to a higher authority. For them, the socialists and anarchists who quailed at the Soviet Union's harsh but necessary methods of rule had no real interest in defeating their class enemies. The rural pueblo had been surpassed by the rush of history, and only by moving through the contradictions of modernization, not by avoiding them, and guided by the only workers' party anywhere in the world to achieve state power, the Soviet Union, could victory be achieved. The Communist Party of Spain, like the Falange, was electorally marginal, but boasted an outsized organizational capacity, and had new marching orders from the Comintern in Moscow. Until 1933, the Comintern, the Communist International that coordinated communist actions from Moscow, had insisted that no communist party cooperate in any way with liberal or non-communist socialist parties or unions. According to the official third period ideology of the time, capitalism was in its death throes, and social fascist left parties only existed to keep it alive unnaturally. After a fatal split between the German Social Democrats and the German Communists that allowed Hitler to come to power in Germany, Soviet policy changed dramatically. To prevent fascism from achieving power elsewhere, communists were now told to drop their hostility to non-communist parties and to form broad popular front coalitions wherever possible against a mutually conceived fascist threat. So in 1935, Spanish communists extended feelers to the liberal and Marxist parties about creating just such an alliance. In May, Gil Robles claimed the war ministry and promoted reliably right-wing officers such as General Franco, who was made chief of staff, while purging known Republican sympathizers from the army. It was only a matter of time before SEDA claimed the prime ministership. This was unacceptable to President Zamora, and LaRue's radical party was undone by a very fitting gambling scandal. It's very complicated and dumb, but LaRue is apparently bribed by a Dutch con artist, a Lyle Landley-style guy, to legalize a specific type of roulette wheel for legal gambling in Spain. And in so doing, he brought down the Republic, the Radical Party, and made it so that the CETA would have to lead the government for it to continue. So Zamora was caught between the procedures of the Constitution and his own liberal interests. Gil Robles insisted on the right to form a new government, but a Prime Minister Gil Robles might end democracy, as Mussolini, Dollfuss, and Hitler had. Rather than allow that to happen, Zamora used his presidential prerogative to dissolve the Cortes on January 4th, 1936, and call new elections to be held on February 16th. The next month saw a frenzied, hysteric round of campaigning, with a popular front of the liberal Republicans and Marxists arrayed against a national front of right-wing parties. Both sides used radio broadcasts, mass rallies, and billboards to paint a terrifying picture of what victory by their opponents would bring. A right-wing paper wrote, "The fortune of Spain, 300,000 million pesetas, will be nationalized and taken over or destroyed by Soviet communism. Those who haven't lost their lives will be out of work, in the street with only the clothes on their back. Workers, employees, civil servants, if you vote for the communist, socialist, leftist, revolutionary bloc, you will be slaves, working only for bad food and poor clothing." Folks, poor clothing. And eating only at bad food restaurants? The bad food government, no thank you. A Popular Front placard rejoined, "The CETA and its accomplices are asking you for your votes in order to continue their work of terror, injustice, and theft of the past 2 years. The Popular Front asks for your help and your votes to free 30,000 men from jail, to make sure 70,000 return to their workplaces, and to demand retribution of the torturers and thieves." Much of the race ended up being a litigation on the October 34 Asturias revolt. The Popular Front promised amnesty for the imprisoned and vowed to end workplace discrimination against leftists. As usual, the anarchists rejected the choice and condemned the state in toto. Solidaridad Obrera, the official CNT newspaper, wrote, "The problem of Spain is not one of political change, but of transforming the economy. In the elections, the proletariat is aligned with the bourgeois parties, forgetting its essential mission of preparing and organizing itself to transform society." Nevertheless, many anarchists ended up voting for the Popular Front in the hopes that they would at least free their revolutionary brothers and sisters from prison. And crucially, both sides implied heavily that they would not accept the election of the other peacefully. For all the blood and thunder of the campaign, the election itself was relatively peaceful and free of controversy, though of course there was some. The results reflected the reality of a deeply divided country. 4.6 million votes cast for the Popular Front, 4.5 million votes for the National Front, with 500,000 for the rapidly disappearing center, which included the Basque nationalist parties. The vagaries of apportionment resulted in a huge Popular Front majority in the Cortes. For the left, it felt like a vindication. For the right, it felt like the end of the world. The short and turbulent life of the Popular Front government was packed with frenzied incident, all of which occurred in an atmosphere of economic freefall. Spain's wealthiest citizens immediately punished the country for the crime of voting for the left, with factory closures and a capital strike that saw the value of the peseta plummet in world markets. An increasingly radical Largo Caballero refused to allow the Socialist Party to claim any ministries in the new government. From his position outside of it, Largo spoke repeatedly about the futility of legal politics and the inevitability of social revolution, to the deep frustration of the nerd Preto. Both supporters and detractors saw Largo as the Spanish Lenin, waiting in the wings to overthrow the shaky Popular Front. But this rhetorical posture was aimed at keeping the radical braceros of the rural UGT from defecting to the anarchists, and Largo showed little of the brutal initiative of the Bolsheviks in 1917. In this respect, he mirrored his enemy Gil Robles, whose ambivalence to the idea of a right-wing seizure of power saw him eclipsed in the Cortes by the monarchist firebrand Kelvo Sotelo, who spent his brief time in the Cortes trolling the fuck out of the left every day, saying, "Wouldn't it be funny if we did a coup? Haha, but no, seriously. What if we couped? No, seriously. Well, I wouldn't do that, of course not. But seriously, what if we did? What if we couped? No, seriously. I'm kidding. But maybe? What do you think? I don't know. Could we coup? We'll see. Pooh. The systematic violence of Spanish social life exploded into public clashes between gunslinging young phalangists and socialists in Madrid. This violence wasn't stopped by the outlawing of the Falange in March or the imprisonment of its leader, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, on gun charges. In Extremadura, tens of thousands of landless peasants took agrarian reform into their own hands, occupying latifundist land and attempting to farm it without access to capital for tools or seeds. Those imprisoned after Asturias were released, and blacklisted employees were ordered to be rehired. In Barcelona, the Generalitat was restored and Companys was released from prison. In May, Prieto orchestrated the cynical impeachment of President Zamora for his decision to dissolve the previous government, and he was replaced by the only politician acceptable to all Popular Front parties, the August Republican statesman Manuel Azana. The way they impeached Zamora was so cold-blooded. He had stopped Gil Robles from being prime minister by dissolving the government. And then because Prieto wanted somebody he could trust more and was more connected to the left wing, they impeached him for dissolving the parliament. Just cold-blooded. But politics ain't beanbag, folks. Bye-bye, Zamora. The liberal Galician lawyer Cesar Quiroga became prime minister. By the way, I got to put this in there just because it's bugging me. He's not technically prime minister, okay? The position is called the president of the Council of Ministers. It's very annoying that it's not prime minister, but that's why I just say prime minister, because it's faster. But anyway, I can't stop thinking about it. Sorry for that. In June, UGT and CNT construction workers went on strike in Madrid. Later that month, the socialist and communist youth movements merged under socialist leadership, but with communist direction. The energy of the youth powered much of the political instability of the time. It must be emphasized. So Spain at this point is a sclerotic society riven with internal tensions that is being drowned in testosterone. You had that baby boom of the World War I era that is now coming into young manhood. And it is young men in the socialist movement, in the anarchist movement, and the young señoritos, the students of the middle class who end up fighting it out in the streets, shooting one another as a way to express a otherwise inexpressible political will to power. On July 2nd, in Madrid, 2 phalangists were killed in a cafe drive-by, leading to the reprisal murder of 2 workers leaving a Casa del Pueblo. On July 12th, Juan Castillo, an assault guard lieutenant and Socialist Party member who had provided military training to a socialist militia, was assassinated by phalangists. The next day, some of his assault guard comrades sought revenge. After searching for several potential targets, including Gil Robles, they eventually drove to the home of Calvo Sotelo and knocked on the door in the dead of night. They roused Calvo from bed and took him to their car where he was promptly shot. The next day, Castillo and Sotelo were both buried, the day culminating in a shootout between phalangist and assault guards that left 4 dead. Among the middle class, the constant refrain was that this couldn't go on any longer, that something had to be done. It was, of course, rich, coming from people who were largely responsible for exacerbating the conditions through capital strike. The bourgeois at this time are closing factories, pushing their money out of the country, accelerating conflict, and then they say the resulting political violence must not go on. Something has to happen. For braceros and workers struggling to survive and frustrated by the pace of reform, the sentiment was similar. This could not be allowed to continue. President Azana appeared to all as the Spanish Kerensky, but with Largo incapable of fulfilling his role as Spanish Lenin, the future appeared to be a continued, agonized stalemate. Brittle Republican institutions could not contain the roiling class conflict, but no political faction had the organizational capacity to press their advantage. Since the early 19th century, this sort of deliberative exhaustion was always resolved by the one institution of Spanish life capable of forceful independent action: the army. The victory of the Popular Front had caught the right by surprise. Franco himself had wept and begged Gil Robles to declare martial law, but the parliamentary leader did not want to make the first move in abolishing democracy. Whether they're from the left or the right, bourgeois politicians are all allergic to responsibility. Carlist aristocrats began smuggling weapons and creating training camps for their peasant requetes, but they lacked the numbers to initiate a successful coup. A requete is the name for a Carlist soldier, the yeoman farmer. It's like a Minuteman. It's the Spanish Minuteman. ready to go from his hoe to his to take the rifle off of his mantelpiece and be ready in 5 minutes. That is the requete. But they lacked the numbers to initiate a successful coup. They only really had the popular base really up there in Navarre. The new Popular Front government was well aware that the upper ranks of the military were fundamentally hostile to them, and one of their first acts was to disperse the more reactionary generals away from positions of authority in the capital. Before they all went their separate ways, a number of these generals met on March 5th in Madrid to discuss a plan of action. At the meeting were Generals Franco and Goded, the conquerors of Asturias, as well as other future leaders of the military rising, names like Fanjul, Kindelan, and Mola. Of them all, Franco was the most hesitant to sign off on a rebellion. One thing these generals all had in common was that they had risen up the ranks fighting in Morocco, not moldering on the peninsula. It's not accurate to really say that the army rose against the Republic in 1936. The Peninsular Officer Corps were mostly contented bureaucrats with no desire to rock the boat either way, and the common soldiers were largely sullen peasant and working class conscripts. The rising was made by those who had fought and killed for Spain in the last remnant of its once globe-spanning empire, where nationalist bluster was consecrated in blood and turned real. The soldiers they would depend on to spearhead the rising were the well-blooded Spanish and Moroccan mercenaries occupying the Rif. On the peninsula, the moving force of rebellion were the junior officers, those precariously balanced between hostile subordinates and impassive superiors. For them, a military government promised something that had been hard to come by in an army where officers guarded their positions: promotion. So you have a situation where you have people who have one way or another been brutalized into weapons of violence, like the officers and men in the Moroccan army, and then those in the Peninsular Army who were molded into weapons of ambition by their middle class position between the rank and file and their superiors, who sat there like fat ticks on those sinecures and never ever retired. These junior officers were organized in a clandestine group, the Spanish Military Union, UME. In 1936, there were 3,400 active duty army officers in the UME and another 1,800 reserved and retired auxiliaries. They are the ones who did the work of building a coup infrastructure within Spain. The Popular Front move to scatter the reactionary generals backfired dramatically. Franco was sent to the Canary Islands, which is just a short hop from Spanish Morocco. Goded was sent to the Balearic Islands, a short hop from Barcelona. Emiliano Mola, an owlish, bespectacled administrative whiz, was sent to Pamplona, the capital of Navarre, heartland of Carlism. Once there, Mola immediately began. It's almost like they did it on purpose. I don't think they did, but it might as well have been. Every one of them went a place where they would be needed to supervise the creation of an infrastructure for a coup. Once there, Mola immediately began discussions with the leading Carlist aristocrats about a military-civilian alternative government. He understood that the era of the simple pronunciamento was over. Civilian support would be crucial to standing up a new state. The Carlists set up a headquarters across the border in France to facilitate liaisons with members of the UME. After a botched amateurish coup was easily foiled in April, General Mola took control of all military planning under the codename The Director. Couriers, often high society ladies and dashing young junior officers, traveled across the country to bring key army personnel into the conspiracy. It was agreed that the exiled General San Giorgio would be the figurehead of the new government, and Mola had to conduct excruciating negotiations with the Carlists over the look and feel of the new state. After the Civil War, there would be claims that the Sotelo assassination had been the last straw which forced the army to act. But the only reason the rising hadn't already happened at that point was because of an argument between Mola and the Carlists about the flag that they would be flying during the rebellion. Now, Mola, as a modern pragmatic officer, understood that the monarchy had lost legitimacy among the people of Spain and wanted to rise on behalf of the Republic, which was a vital and legitimate political institution, and to argue that the communists and anarchists were destroying it. And as such, he wanted to fight under the Republican bicolor. But the Carlists demanded that the army rise under the old monarchist tricolor, because the Carlist leaders were a bunch of goofball aristocrats, a bunch of LARPing military popinjays, whereas the military rising was led by hard-headed realists and professionals. Folks, we love hierarchy and all, but we also know it's the 20th century. The king is embarrassing. It's a cringe idea. This argument grew so tedious and protracted that Mola, who was a kind of a excitable sort, considered suicide, but eventually a compromise was reached, basically because the eagerness of the Carlist rank and file to get on with it overrode the political scruples of the leadership. The Minutemen in the countryside are polishing their fucking machetes. They're ready to go. They don't give a fuck what a flag looks like. And it's them that kind of push the Carlists into making a agreement that ends up fucking them over. From his prison cell, Jose Antonio, the leader of the Flange, committed his forces to the rising as well. Even Franco eventually got off the fence and signed on. The date would be July 18th. The army would take Spanish Morocco, and the next day, UME officers would lead troops out of their barracks to take the cities of the peninsula. Mola would consolidate power in the north, Gueded would take Catalonia, and Franco would advance to the south from Morocco, all to converge triumphantly on Madrid. It's correct to call the coup plotting a conspiracy, but it was not really in any way secret. There were a small number of left-wing junior officers in the army. They had their own organization, the UMRA, and they were aware at all points what their colleagues were doing. Nobody was hiding it. They were being told at mess hall, like, get ready, Red, we're going to kill you. But every attempt to alert the liberals in charge of the Popular Front government was ignored. Even civilians, like the communist representative Dolores Iburi, known as La Pasionera for her fiery speeches, warned the government about what was coming. They knew. Now, the government, President Azana and Prime Minister Quiroga, were adamant that the military posed no threat. They likely thought any coup that would happen would be another pratfall, an opportunity to root out disloyal officers and bolster the government's legitimacy. They also knew that acting first to dismantle the plot would mean ordering the military to essentially turn on itself, a proposition that no one in the Popular Front government trusted. For Azana, it came down to this: if I order this coup to be stopped, I might very well start it, because the army will refuse and turn on me. But again, the allergy to responsibility of the bourgeois politician means that they had to live in cloud cuckoo land and wait passively for something to happen. It was either do that or do something that Prieto had demanded from the prime minister on the night of Sotelo's assassination: arm the workers. Head off the rising by giving guns to the working class. Quiroga refused. Without confidence in itself and fearful of the working class, the government instead chose denial. In July, some frustrated UMRA left-wing officers hatched a plot to kidnap or kill the leading conspirators, to do something. But Quiroga found out about it and thwarted it. Regardless of the mounting violence in the streets, the escalating apocalyptic rhetoric, and the general breakdown of social life, the liberal leaders of the Republic refused to believe a breach was in the offing. Meanwhile, officers across Spain and Morocco awaited telegrams bearing the code word Covadonga, to signal that the time had come. Covadonga is a small town in Asturias, and the site of the first Christian victory over Muslim forces in Spain in 722 AD, a victory that had begun the centuries-long process of reconquest. This was how the generals and Carlists and Phalangists and sympathetic bourgeois who would end up composing the nationalist side of the Civil War saw their task: the reconquest of Spain from the forces of godless Judeo-Bolshevism and the reestablishment of eternal Spanish values. They would make a modern Spain on the backs of the workers, unhindered by carping liberals. The rising began in betrayal. On the morning of July 17th, in Miella, the capital of Spanish Morocco, one of the conspirators informed loyal authorities of the plot, which was scheduled to begin the next day. When officers attempted to arrest the plotters, a standoff ensued that saw the loyal officers surrender to the superior elan of the plotters. The rebellious soldiers moved quickly to seize control of the city, arrest the commanding general and mayor, and declare martial law. There were a small number of left-wing workers in the city who rallied at the Casa de Pueblo. They were promptly massacred. Spain may have avoided the mass trauma of World War I, but the Africanistas who had made the rebellion had seen their share of carnage in the Rif War and were not squeamish about dishing it out to their enemies, Republican officials and militant workers. In Las Palmas, in the Canary Islands, Franco pushed the timetable ahead a day and quickly took control there, sending a telegram message to forces across Spain. Glory to the heroic army of Africa. Spain above everything. Accept the enthusiastic greeting of those garrisons which join you and all the other comrades in the peninsula in this historic moment. Blind faith in victory. Long live Spain with honor. Franco's Hamlet Act hadn't prevented him from arranging a private air charter, courtesy of the tobacco millionaire Juan March and an English Catholic publisher, which had secretly made its way from England to the Canaries over the previous week. Now, Franco took the de Havilland Dragon Rapide from Las Palmas to Spanish Morocco, where resistance to the rising was wiped out within a day. Executions soon followed, including that of Franco's first cousin, authorized by Franco's own hand. By the evening of the 17th, the government in Madrid was fully aware of what was happening across the Strait of Gibraltar, but PM Quiroga rejected a request from the unions to distribute arms to the workers, insisting that at every turn that trust in the military powers of the state. The next day at noon, General Gonzalo Quepodiano, commander of the Carboneri border police, took control of the local garrison in Seville, again just by walking in and acting like he was in charge. That is how Quepodiano took Seville. Because he was a Carboneri, he was not in the military hierarchy. He just marched, he had lunch, and then he walked into the barracks and said, march out under my orders, and everyone just did. Because he wanted to do something as opposed to just sit around all day and brush flies away from his face. What happened next established the pattern of the rising across the country. The decisiveness of government and the union leadership determined the fate of the city. In Seville, existing tension between the UGT and the CNT led to paralysis. In places like Madrid and Seville, there had actually been more violence between the socialists and the anarchists than between the anarchists and the Falange at any point. A joint general strike was announced over the union-operated radio stations, but the workers remained hunkered down in their neighborhoods, while Quepodiano consolidated his control over the center of the city and began broadcasting the first of what would become nightly drunken, taunting radio broadcasts. This was the first modern conflict to be transmitted over the radio waves and the first modern conflict to be podcasted, because Quepodiano is a podcaster at heart. He spends the war giving hour-long harangues about how the Republic was going to be destroyed, how all the Reds were going to get killed, how all their girlfriends were going to fall in love with the nationalists. Just trash talk nonstop. Incredibly vulgar stuff, really. A dirtbag rightist for certain. And on his first broadcast, Quepo vowed he would reestablish order that had been subverted by foreign powers, and he condemned the Marxist conglomerate that had deformed the character of Spain. That night, the CNT in Barcelona sprang into action in the face of the Generalitat's paralysis, grabbing weapons wherever they could and bracing for the morning. Barcelona was deemed critical to the success of the rising, and with 12,000 troops in Catalonia and General Gudet set to fly in from the Balearics, all of which quickly fell to the rebels, success seemed assured. At 5 a.m. on the morning of the 19th, troops from the Pedralbes barracks were told by their officers that they were being deployed to put down another one of those pesky cyclical anarchist uprisings. They were marched out to claim key buildings in the city center. This was a story that would have been very believable to any regular Joe in the Spanish army. The anarchists are at it again. They're out there hooting and hollering in the streets. We got to go tell them to stop. But General Gudet didn't arrive to coordinate the rising until later in the day, and the initial push into the city was haphazard, with units scattered, uncoordinated, and immediately beset by militants. Soon, the rebel soldiers were either barricaded in their barracks or under siege in those crucial buildings, like the major hotels and the telephone exchange they had been occupied. By the time Gudet's plane arrived from Mallorca, the rising's momentum had been blunted. Meanwhile, CNT workers drove trucks loaded with loudspeakers around the city to relay news and raise morale. At this crucial moment, the Civil Guard commander marched his forces into the middle of the city, and to the surprise and elation of the crowd, they declared their allegiance to the Republic. Now, this is likely more due to the desire to back what looked like a winning horse than because of any ideological commitment, But the actions of the Guard were still crucial to rolling up the rebellion in Barcelona. In Montjuïc Castle, towering over the city, soldiers shot their nationalist officers and handed guns over to the CNT. Assault guards and workers convinced an army artillery crew to turn their guns on rebel strongholds. Across the city, troops, who were largely peasant conscripts after all, began to switch sides. Captured artillery forced the surrender of General Godet, who agreed to announce his capitulation in a nationwide radio broadcast, which was a huge morale blow wherever it was heard by the right. He would be shot for treason in August. Across the city, churches burned, and priests, who were thought to be aiding the rebels, were killed. By the night of the 19th, the central city had been cleared of rebels. Most of the buildings had been taken by some combination of civil and assault guard, but the telephone exchange had been captured by CNT militants. The only remaining holdout were the troops and officers of the Atarazanas barracks near the port of Barcelona. On the morning of the 20th, the CNT insisted on claiming the prize for themselves and putting their stamp on the successful suppression of the uprising. Waves of anarchists charged at the barracks, suffering heavy casualties. Francisco Escaso, one of the most influential CNT radicals and a close collaborator of Durruti, was one of the first to fall. Even after air power and artillery, which could have pounded the barracks into submission, were brought in, the anarchists continued to swarm the barracks until it finally surrendered. Over 500 anarchists died in the assault. And that is really the mark of anarchist military power. They are highly motivated, but they don't take orders, and they are hard to coordinate. Herding pissed off armed cats. A huge energy XP at a huge cost of efficiency. But the catch-22 is that what motivated them was their sense of freedom, that they were doing it of their own will, and that they were being uncoerced. But coercion is the key to the military efficiency that allows you to effectively deploy forces. It is a Gordian knot that they never figure out how to unwrap. These deaths didn't dampen the atmosphere of giddy festivity that seized Barcelona that evening. Armored cars paraded through the cities, tapping out a honk meant to represent the letters CNTFAI. Every street corner thronged with celebrants drunk on victory and vino. For the anarchists of the city, some 60% of the working class population, their triumph was the ultimate triumph of the idea. The people of the city had come together to beat back the forces of fascism, even converting the civil guard and large numbers of simple soldiers to their cause through their passion and direct human communication. The millennium had arrived. A new world was possible, and it was being built with every breath through the spontaneous actions of the workers of the city. The CNT was armed. The Generalitat was at their mercy. The future was unwritten. But the fate of the revolution in Barcelona would depend on how the rising fared across the rest of Spain.
Arriba los foques del mundo, arriba todos a luchar, por la justicia proletaria, nuevo mundo nace ya. Destrocemos todas las cadenas de esclavitud tradicional. Y quienes nunca fueron nada, dueños del mundo hoy serán. A la lucha proletarios, al combate final.
3 o'clock on the afternoon of May 3rd, 1937, 200 police officers, under the command of the Catalan Commissioner of Public Order, Eusebio Rodriguez Salas, arrived at the massive Telefonica building in central Barcelona. The Telefonica was the main telephone exchange for the city and had been under the control of the anarchist CNT since its members had captured it from rebellious soldiers in the first days of the Civil War. Rodriguez Salas, a former anarchist who, like many Republican military and police officers, had drifted from socialism to communism over the course of the war. He sought to take over the building on behalf of the Catalan government and end the anarchist stranglehold on communications in Barcelona. As police entered the building, anarchists on the second floor began firing down onto the street from the windows and stairwells. A standoff ensued between police on the first floor and the anarchists above them. As word of the raid spread throughout the city, CNT militiamen, as well as members of the dissident communist Party of Marxist Unification, or POUM, I'm going to call them, soon filled the streets, throwing up barricades and trading fire with police and troops loyal to the central government. By nightfall, the city was divided, with government forces holding the east and anarchists holding the west and suburbs, sporadically shooting it out in the city center. Thus began the Civil War within the Civil War, as an alliance of bourgeois parties and communists sought to break the independent power of the anarchists that had persisted since arms had been first distributed to CNT workers to put down the rising. The necessities of war had finally begun building modern state capacity in Spain, in both the nationalist and loyalist zones. But in nationalist Spain, the process was dominated by the military, which acted to smooth any political conflict between factions of the nationalist movement. In the loyalist area, however, the bourgeois communist coalition that had taken control of political institutions had to contend with an anarchist movement which dominated urban Catalonia and rural Aragon, and was there exercising military and economic power to build an alternative to the modern state, a social order that replaced the hierarchies of the modern state with horizontal networks of free producers. This project struck terror to the hearts of the loyal bourgeois and infuriated a communist party which saw rapprochement with the bourgeois as the most pressing interest both of Spain and of Russia. The anarchists insisted that there was no need to negotiate some tortured alliance with the slave masters of society with the hope of someday taking the whip for themselves. In the CNT's factories and farm collectives, they had broken the whip and made a new world. For them, state capacity was the capacity to enslave. Communists, wedded to the interests of the Soviet Union, thought no revolution was worthwhile that could not sustain itself, and only the tremendous productive powers currently in the hands of capitalist states could sustain them. For the communists, state capacity was the capacity to liberate. The May events in Barcelona would break the impasse between the two visions of liberation, visions which had been given life by the decision of the army conspirators to overthrow the Republic in 1936. 11 months earlier, on the night of July 19, 1936, the mood in Barcelona was vastly different. Crowds thronged the street in celebration of the successful suppression of the rising in the city. The bourgeois Generalitat accepted the fait accompli and distributed arms to the workers, who busied themselves turning their ad hoc defense committees into functional militias. But the festive mood was cut with an edge of anxiety. The army and its fascist hangers-on had been defeated in Barcelona, but what was happening in the rest of the country? While the rising was being put down in Barcelona, 2,000 little civil wars broke out in the cities, towns, and villages of Spain. In almost all cases, the outcome was determined by which side took the initiative. Wherever the local military conspirators seized control of their garrisons and marched out decisively, they usually secured their locality for the rising, unless the civil authorities acted quickly to arm workers. The fates of two cities on opposite ends of the country are instructive in this case. On the 19th, the civil governor of Jaén in Andalusia immediately disarmed the civil guard and distributed guns to the city's workers. The workers surrounded the local military barracks before the troops could even muster, and the rising was defeated. The rising began late in the northern province of Galicia, and there, in the port city of Coruna, the civil governor, a close friend of the prime minister, refused to arm the workers and insisted on the loyalty of the garrison. Rebel troops soon marched out and took the city and promptly executed the civil governor. His pregnant wife would later be raped and murdered by phalangists. Miners fled the city for the Basque capital of Bilbao, or took to the hills to begin the first of what would become many guerrilla campaigns, flaring on and off for years behind nationalist lines. Also on the Atlantic coast, the local troops in Santander refused their officers' orders to rise. But the Asturian capital of Oviedo, headquarters of the October 34 miners' revolt, was taken by an act of subterfuge. There, the local military commander, Colonel Aranda, had spent the preceding months swearing to everyone who would listen to him that he was loyal to the Republic. With the local authorities assured of his support, thousands of armed miners left Oviedo to relieve Madrid, where the uprising was ongoing. When the miners left, Aranda swiftly declared for the rising and deployed his troops to occupy the city. The miners eventually returned to encircle Oviedo in a protracted siege. In Pamplona, capital of Carlism, General Mola's troops marched out of their barracks to the cheers of middle-class crowds. Thousands of Requete volunteers put down their farm tools, left their small holds, and flocked to the city to volunteer, to march on Madrid, shouting the Carlist slogan, Viva Cristo Rey! They marched out of the city singing, Give me my beret, give me my rifle. I'm going to kill more Reds than there are flowers in April and May. It probably sounds better in Spanish. The first Reds killed there were the workers who gathered at the city's Casa del Pueblo. But in the rest of the Basque Country, the alliance between nationalists and the Popular Front held. The social radicalism and anti-clericalism of the Popular Front disgusted middle-class Basques, but only the Popular Front government promised to maintain Basque autonomy. In Bilbao and San Sebastian, Basque nationalists and radical workers put their differences aside to secure the Basque lands for the Republic. Castile mostly fell to the rebels. Valladolid was taken, and the railway workers, who formed the only real industrial proletariat in the area, were massacred. In Burgos, the heart of old Spain, the rising was effected as an orderly transfer of power and a methodical massacre of Popular Front officials and union leaders. On the 20th, aristocratic worthies gathered at the local airstrip to welcome the airplane of the coup's figurehead, General San Giorgio. They would leave disappointed. At the airstrip in Portugal, where San Giorgio was set to depart, the general had insisted on bringing his collection of heavy dress uniforms onto an already overloaded small plane. The plane failed to lift off and crashed immediately into a stand of trees. The Lion of the Rif was dead, and with him any chance that Carlism would be a decisive influence on the shape of the nationalist cause. You can't get better than that one. It's just as a pure fable. This fucking buffoonish, narcissistic military maniac demanding that he look as fresh as possible, that his aesthetics, if you will, be fully on point, and it causes their plane to crash. Some sort of metaphor in there somewhere. Cadiz and Granada on the southern coast fell after pitched battles between soldiers and workers. Colonel Martinez Monge, commander of troops in Valencia, he both refused to lead his troops out of the barracks, but he also refused to declare his allegiance to the Republic. Everyone was asking him on the radio, what are you doing? And he was just like, I'm thinking. Eventually, though, the local CMT got sick of waiting to get arms from the civil governor and just took them, and then occupied the radio station and telegraph exchange. The anarchists surrounded the barracks and waited for this guy to shit or get off the pot, and they did that for 2 weeks before they finally got sick of waiting and just went in and disarmed the troops. So you got the one guy in Spain who just, the choice was too much. In smaller towns and villages, where the only military force might be a handful of civil guard and communication with any authority was difficult, the spontaneous actions of the population decided things, but only until reinforcements from one side or the other arrived. The pattern of the uprising was similar in many places. Local conspirators acted to arrest loyal officials, then would read off a declaration of martial law from the town hall balcony as their forces occupied strategic buildings and began rounding up known Republicans and leftists. Sometimes that meant summary execution, sometimes it meant imprisonment, all of this depending on the mood and character of the local coup leadership. Where the local civil guard seized power behind Republican lines, it was only a matter of time before a workers' militia column arrived to take control and execute their rebel prisoners. In those first frenzied days, two zones were bloodily established. About a third of the country, a broad crescent running from Navarre in the northeast to Galicia in the northwest, through Castile down to Granada to the south, had fallen to the rebels. Coastal Asturias and the Basque Country were held by loyalists, but cut off from the rest of Republican Spain in the east and south. The loyalists were so called that for their loyalty to the government in Madrid. But at that point, no one in either zone really knew what the government in Madrid entailed. Prime Minister Quiroga, who had led a 3-hour cabinet meeting before informing his ministers that the army had risen in Morocco, he knew what had happened. He went in, he did a cabinet meeting, and then afterward, he's like, oh, by the way, the troops are rebelling in Morocco. He resigned at 4 a.m. on the morning of the 19th, saying, "I'm out, not going to work. I cannot do this. You need a wartime consigliere." President Azana frantically tried to replace him with one of his liberal Republican allies in the cabinet. The first was Diego Martinez Barrio, an arch conciliator who was kind of a Henry Clay-esque great compromiser among the Popular Front forces. He had called Mola in Pamplona and tried to make a deal. He offered him a position in the government in exchange for standing down. And Mola, to his credit, at least had the clarity to understand that the time for politics had ended, that the sides had been drawn, and that the contest would continue to the death. Martinez Barrio resigned within hours. If that's not going to work, I have no ideas. Azana next tapped Jose Giral, who finally accepted the reality of the situation, officially dissolved the army, and ordered weapons to be distributed to the workers of Madrid. General Mieja, the top loyal commander in the city, who had been a member of the UME before the war and was essentially caught behind Republican lines, argued vociferously against this course before finally relenting. 60,000 rifles were dispatched to the headquarters of the labor unions. But as a security measure, most of them had had their bolts removed and stored at a separate location. The location was the Montana Barracks, whose rebel commander refused any orders to relinquish them, but had yet to march his troops into the city. The top conspirator in Madrid, General Fanjul, who had reduced Asturias along with Franco, made his way to the Montana Barracks just as it was being surrounded by an angry armed crowd of workers. La Pasionera, communism's most eloquent exponent in the Cortes, rallied the population from the radio as the siege began. The next day, while the Atzanares barracks in Barcelona were being surrounded, artillery commanded by a left-wing retired army colonel sighted in on the Montana. Loyal planes dropped leaflets on the soldiers inside. Then, when surrender wasn't forthcoming, bombs. Many of the common soldiers in the Montana barracks were not so keen to die for eternal Spain, and eventually one of them rushed in a suicidal charge to open the front gates. The crowd swarmed in and the officers were massacred. General Fanjul survived to be executed by a firing squad in August. Firearms and rifle bolts quickly filled the hands of workers throughout the city. While Azana and his allies tried to come to terms with the situation, the de facto governing body in Madrid became the UGT Union Executive Committee. Churches burned across the city as armed workers formed themselves into military columns to defend against the inevitable rebel attack. Mola's Carlist forces did make a push for the capital, and the workers' militias faced them in the passes of the Guadarrama Mountains, northwest of Madrid. The nationalist drive stalled out there due to a lack of ammunition, as the two sides of the nascent civil war established control of their respective zones. The material limitations of the Spanish state asserted themselves. The Peninsular Army had been built for urban pacification, not pitched combat. It was under-equipped, most Spanish military hardware was imported and low quality, and under-motivated. Most of the common soldiers were reluctant peasant conscripts with no emotional allegiance to the nationalist cause. Many of the remaining Republican officers were only geographically loyal, their side determined not by ideology, but by where they found themselves when the conflict began. Even with an untrustworthy officer corps, the Loyalist side could still boast 50,000 soldiers led by 22 generals and 7,000 officers, with an additional 33,000 members of the various paramilitary forces, the Civil Guard, Assault Guard, Carabinieri, as well as huge numbers of armed and militant workers. Facing them were 50,000 peninsular troops led by 17 generals and 10,000 officers with 30,000 paramilitaries. Given this array of forces and the fact that the Republic held the vast majority of Spain's industrial and resource capacity, its gold reserves, and richest cash crop region, Valencia oranges powered Spain's export economy, the nationalists were at an extreme disadvantage. They had basically captured all of the agricultural land. The rural-dominated reactionary heartland fell most easily to the nationalists. The cities were largely held by the Republic. So this looks like the Republic is in good shape until you factor in the existence of the Army of Africa. General Franco was soon in command of 40,000 highly trained, battle-blooded Spanish and Moroccan mercenaries. And the fate of the national cause, now that the rising had failed, depended on getting those forces across the Mediterranean and bringing the colonial war home. The plan to transport the Army of Africa to Spain was hindered by the catastrophic failure of the nationalists on the high seas. In the army barracks, the support of the common troops was often secured through fraud, like we saw in Barcelona. Their commanding officers, the conspirators, would march the troops out under the pretext of some radical uprising that had to be put down. With no other information to go on, many of these troops carried out the work of the nationalists unknowingly until it was too late. Things were different in the Navy. When Franco sent a telegram to his co-conspirators among the junior officers on the various deployed ships, it was intercepted by a loyal Marine Ministry telegraph operator who sent messages to every ship's radio that was functioning, not all of them were, warning of the plot and freeing any loyal sailor of obligation to obey rebellious officers. They got a get-out-of-mutiny free card from the central government. So the common sailors, who were largely working class and wildly alienated from their commanding officers in this, the most self-consciously aristocratic of the Spanish armed forces, quickly organized resistance. On ship after ship, the rebel officers were either arrested by their men or died fighting them. On the battleship Jaime I, the triumphant crew sent a message to the Marine Ministry. We have had serious resistance from the commanders and officers on board and have subdued them by force. Urgent request instructions as to bodies. The response came, Ministry of Marine to crew of Jaime I. Lower bodies overboard with respectful solemnity. What is your present position? Soon, a large percentage of Spain's naval vessels were commanded by crews loyal to the Republic. The instantaneous decapitation of the officer corps would hinder effective use of the Navy by the Republic for the rest of the war, but at that moment, it hugely disrupted the nationalist plan to ferry the Army of Africa across the Med. If the Spanish Civil War had truly been a Spanish affair, this situation might likely have led to a Republican victory within the year. But the military and civilian leaders of the rebellion had spent the previous months securing covert material support for the rising from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Carlist aristocrats were able to secure money and weapons for Mussolini, and they even sent Requetes to train in Rome. Meanwhile, as Franco was playing Hamlet to the other Spanish conspirators, he was reaching out to figures within the Nazi Party in Germany, stealing a march on the Carlists, who were stuck working through the sluggish veins of the German foreign ministry. At this point, people really didn't understand the nature of the Nazi Party state, and that there still was a older, largely aristocratic bureaucracy that made up one part of the German state, and that you would traditionally deal with, like the ministry. But if you wanted to get anything done, you went to the party, which is what Franco did. By the day of the rising, Franco had secured substantial pledges of support from Hitler. While the sailors' committees trying to secure control of the bulk of the Spanish Navy clumsily tried to blockade Morocco, 2 German pocket battleships screened a small number of nationalist watercraft that transported legionnaires and Moroccan regulares to the peninsula. More importantly, Hitler provided a fleet of Junkers aircraft to effect the first mass air transportation of troops in world history. Spain is going to be the first place that pretty much everything that we associate with modern 20th century warfare is innovated.
Auf der Heide blüht ein kleines Möbelein und das heißt Erika.
They landed in Seville, where Chapo used them first to wipe out resistance in Seville's working-class barrios, and then out to secure the Andalusian countryside. The rising had a familiar pattern in the villages of the south. Local civil guard and prominent right-wingers would announce the rising from the town hall. Braceros with old muskets and pitchforks would mobilize and overwhelm the rebels, taking them as prisoners. Refugees fleeing the rising elsewhere would bring tales of atrocity, and prisoners would be executed. Then, troops from Seville would arrive and carry out a reprisal massacre that dwarfed the first batch of killings. In the town of Baena, 92 right-wingers were killed by peasants, and 700 leftists and Republicans were killed when Capodiano's troops arrived. Capodiano was a bizarre and flamboyant character. An alleged Freemason and a convinced Republican who had been part of an ill-fated anti-monarchist army revolt in 1930, he was deeply disenchanted by the actual shape of the Republican government and began drunken nightly radio broadcasts in which he taunted and insulted his enemies while glorying in the righteous bloodshed being visited upon them. He was confident enough to announce to all of Spain that an airlift of Morocco's finest was landing in Seville, and promised that, when they arrive, they will hunt down these troublemakers like animals. With the rickety edifice of liberal Spain finally overturned, the vital forces of left and right, which had been restrained by it, burst forth to violently rearrange Spanish society. In the nationalist zone, this meant first and foremost a cleansing, or limpieza, of the corrosive agents of anti-Spain. Loyal military officers and government officials were shot on the absurd charge of treason, followed by the methodical rooting out of labor militants, political subversives, and Freemasons at the direction of local landowners, civil guard commanders, and sometimes local priests. The ranks of the phalange swelled with the sons of the rural bourgeois, who mostly eschewed volunteering for the front in favor of staying behind to settle old scores with exemplary acts of violence in the rear. In Valladolid, the daily public executions of batches of loyalist prisoners became such a popular local spectacle that churro and coffee stands sprouted up to serve the well-dressed, piously Catholic audience. In Andalusia, señoritos organized horseback peasant hunting parties, which they jokingly referred to as agrarian reform because it meant that the landless braceros would finally get their own plot of land. In Granada, the cream of Spain's intellectual class, including the celebrated poet Federico Garcia Lorca, were killed. In Seville province, 8,000 people were executed in 1936. In Cordoba, 10,000 were killed, 1/10 of the city's population. Prisoners would be shot at cemetery walls and their bodies left exposed as warnings and assertions of the power of old Spain. In exchange for seeing their class enemies liquidated, the landowning class and bourgeois in nationalist Spain were finally required to start paying their share to fund the national project. The nationalists cut wages and lengthened the work week, but also instituted an income tax and confiscated private gold. With Spain's gold reserves in Madrid, the nationalist economy depended on funds from oligarchs like Juan March, gold requisition from the country's rich, foreign loans from the same entities which had starved the Second Republic of credit, and trade with Germany. American companies also supported the nationalists, with Ford, Studebaker, and GM supplying 12,000 trucks to nationalist Spain by the end of the war on credit. The Texas Oil Company, led by its fascist chairman Thorkild Reber, that's right, the motherfucker's name was Thorkild. Gee, I wonder if what this guy's opinions on race are. Thorkild Reber, chairman of the Texas Oil Company. This is just the most demonic human you could imagine. Supplied crucial energy inputs. When the rising had begun, there were 5 Texas oil tankers en route in the Atlantic on the way to Spain, and they were ordered by radio to divert to the nationalist zone when they landed. Over the course of the war, Reber would supply the nationalists with nearly 2 million tons of oil, again, mostly on credit, and in the defiance of neutrality acts in the United States that forbid it. The rising had been planned by a coalition of reactionary forces with different social bases and had several dominant personalities among its military leadership. But by the time General Franco arrived in Seville in early August, his ascension to undisputed mastery of the movement was well underway. San Giorgio's wax wings had melted in the Portuguese sun. The animating spirit of the Phalange, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, was facing execution in a Republican jail, and the second most important Falangist leader, Onesimo Redondo, had been killed in the fighting in the Guadaramas outside Madrid. The failure of the coup to seize power everywhere had wounded Director Moya's reputation. Way to go, Moya! You fucked up! And Chapo Delano was making an ass of himself on the radio every night. Meanwhile, tiny, chinless, mild-mannered Franco descended from a line of naval bureaucrats. He had actually wanted to join the Navy, but there were no slots, and he had to join the Army. Franco methodically asserted his dominance. His command of the Army of Africa and his control of the pipeline of German military aid were powerful factors in his favor, but ultimate power would still require him to preside over a total military victory. In the Republican zone, the arming of the workers created a cataclysmic social revolution overnight, and decades of oppression were avenged through spasms of retaliatory violence against the symbols and persons of old Spain. This violence differed from that in the nationalist zone in that it was almost entirely spontaneous, condemned by the central government, with little of the cold-blooded method of Franco's troops in the Phalange, but it still dominated international press reports in the Civil War's early days. The brunt of the violence comes down to the fact that most of the international reporters were in the Loyalist zone, so they were only witness to violence in there. There were much fewer reports of the massacres going on in the early days of the nationalist zone. The brunt of the violence was felt, as it was always the case when the workers and the poor of Spain were given license to vent their hatred on the social order, by the church. An orgy of impious vandalism swept the loyal zone, outside of the Basque Country, where religion was protected, with corpses disinterred out of graveyards and churches burned. The churches that weren't burned were either closed or requisitioned for secular purposes. The day of the public mass in loyal Spain was over. While right-wing press reports copied from the nationalists claimed that tens of thousands of clergy were killed in the early months of the war, the number was actually about 6,000 priests and friars killed, 300 nuns, and 13 bishops. And these deaths were not entirely indiscriminate. Priests who were known to respect their poor parishioners as much as their rich ones were often protected, but those who were seen as lackeys of the landowners would be killed. The same went for shopkeepers, pawnbrokers, and employers. The fair were often spared, the cruel were often killed. In Barcelona, old scores from the days of pistol rule were settled with, you guessed it, pistols. The CNT established control patrols, which hunted down old enemies, manned checkpoints, and conducted home sweeps. In some of these sweeps, the presence of a rosary or a religious statue could be enough to get you into real trouble. Denunciations came from all places. Young, blood-drunk gunmen would take suspects for a fuego, a ride, in the parlance of the gangster movies that filled Spanish cinemas. During the first few months of the war, something like 38,000 suspected rightists were killed, half of them in Madrid and Catalonia alone. The establishment in September of a system of popular tribunals put the cap on the era of blood vengeance in the Republican zone, but at a huge cost to the Republic's reputation abroad and among the loyal bourgeois. During the early months, efforts by the Giral government to tamp down on the reprisal violence was hindered by the fact that the Giral government had almost no authority. The UGT ran Madrid, as mentioned, and quickly acted to take control of public services and production in the city. For a brief period, the capital was infused with a revolutionary attitude, but as the most militant workers in the city made their way to the Guadarrama Mountains to meet Moya's troops, the central government, aided by the Communist Party, was able to reassert control. The same could not be said for Barcelona, where tens of thousands of armed CNT militants dominated the city. On July 20th, Luis Companys had met with the leading anarchists, fresh from taking the Atzinares barracks. They had guns on the table, were covered in bullets, and Companys wisely offered them his resignation. But wary of the idea of holding state power and asserting control when they did not constitute a simple majority of Spaniards, we don't want to do icky authoritarianism. And honestly, we haven't the capacity to do it because we've built our entire organizations around avoiding executing actual authority. The anarchists refused, and they allowed the Generalitat to remain as the formal political power structure in Catalonia, and created a genuine dual power style situation. People talk about dual power. There are very few actual instances of it in history. One is St. Petersburg in 1917. Another is Barcelona in 1936. The anarchists weren't interested in political power anyway. They sought to make political power irrelevant through a total revolution in economic production, and they used the form of the CNT to do it. The immediate aftermath of the failed rising in Barcelona saw not just score-settling violence and religious vandalism, but the wholesale collectivization of the city's economy. In the poor barrios, the streets filled with the sound of sewing machines, hundreds of them, all liberated from pawn shops and returned to their rightful owners. The Ritz Hotel was turned into a free public cafeteria. Tipping was abolished, along with the formal usted form of address and neckties in public. With the owners of most large businesses either dead or fled, C&T workers' committees took up the management of textile factories, department stores, cinemas, and public utilities. Collectivization here is filling the gaps left by an insufficient state capacity and is being carried out by, in all these cases, the pre-existing C&T workers' committees that existed in all of these businesses. Because anarchists were the undigested modern subjects, in crisis, they were the only ones who could actually organize for a purpose. Even when the C&T formed militia columns to retake Zaragoza, the capital of the neighboring province of Aragon, the social revolution continued to unfold. Zaragoza, home to 30,000 C&T members, had fallen to the nationalists in the initial rising. This was a huge blow to anarchist pride and morale, and the C&T made it their mission to retake what had been called the second city of anarchism. In the early days of August, columns of anarchist militants flowed out of Barcelona and moved west into Aragon. Two of the most famous were the Durruti column, named after its commander, Buenaventura Durruti, the FAI militant, and the Iron column, named after a cool type of metal. The columns marched into rural Aragon, and with the help of local landless braceros, expropriated large land holdings and brought smaller ones into agricultural collectives. In some places, this was a spontaneous and largely voluntary process, but in others, where there were more smallholders, the guns of the militias enforced collectivization. We're doing coercion, oops, but it's for good. It's all right. It's okay when anarchists do it. Eventually, the offensive was dispersed by nationalist air power, which tended to scatter the columns as they marched down dusty country roads, only a few miles from Saragossa, and a thinly manned front was established that remained static for the rest of the war. But because the three main cities in Aragon remained in nationalist hands, and there was no loyal governing structure to contend with, anarchists established a Council of Aragon in the part of the province under their control. This was the only place where they wielded executive political power, and the only place where the rural economy was almost entirely collectivized. In the countryside, agricultural collectives dominated.
Viva la FAI y la CNT, luchemos hermanos contra los tiranos y los requetés. Rojo pendón, negro color, luchemos hermanos aunque en la batalla debamos morir.
Meanwhile, the C&T UGT alliance, which had executed the October 34 revolution in Asturias, continued their cooperative tradition by running that province on a collective basis, while also continuing to besiege Oviedo. But in the Basque country, no churches were burned, no businesses were collectivized. A Basque nationalist Republic of Euskadi, dominated by conservative nationalists with leftists in minor positions, attempted to continue liberal Spain as though nothing had happened. The social revolution in Catalonia and Aragon unnerved the bourgeois liberals who dominated urban political life and infuriated the small but fiercely disciplined Communist Party of Spain. With Germany and Italy supplying the nationalists with planes and weapons, and in Italy's case, soon volunteer army forces, the survival of the Republic would hinge on military support from the other Western democracies. Surely England and France, which had just elected its own Popular Front government under Prime Minister Leon Blum, would rally to the defense of their fellow democracy against the fascism that threatened all of them. At first, it seemed that France, at least, would answer the call. Blum's government arranged for the sale and transport of military material to Spain in the last days of July. But due to fear of a backlash from France's own belligerent right wing and the disapproval of Great Britain, the border was closed to military commerce on August 8th. The conservative British government didn't want the Spanish conflict to become a Europe-wide conflict and was happy to sacrifice the Republican government on an altar of quote-unquote non-intervention. In the U.S., the Roosevelt administration, fearful of alienating Catholic voters, also embraced a specious non-interventionism that ignored the open meddling of Germany and Italy. At first, even the USSR endorsed non-intervention. though that would soon change. Stalin's desire for a formal alliance with the Western bourgeois governments produced a communist policy in Spain of support for the bourgeois parties and urban and rural property owners against the anarchists in their efforts to arrest and roll back their social revolution. So the Republic, cut off from foreign military aid, would have to make do with the remnants of the Peninsular Army, as well as thousands of enthusiastic but untrained and undisciplined working-class militiamen. The leadership was divided between career military men, all from the strategically conservative Peninsular Army, many of them ambivalent about the Republican cause, and a growing cadre of card-carrying communists who were fiercely committed to victory but completely deficient in military experience. Meanwhile, 12,000 troops were transported from Morocco to Spain in the first 2 months of the war, mostly by German aircraft. In the south, Franco began his methodical march towards Madrid. First, he sent 1,500-strong columns under Colonel Yagué up along the Portuguese border in Extremadura to connect the nationalist south to the north and cut off the Republic completely from Portugal. Yagué's columns, supported by Italian and German bombers, were a furious buzzsaw. Truck-based attacks blitzed across the province, taking village after village and leaving piles of massacred leftists in their wake. The brave but inexperienced militias before them refused to dig fortifications and were repeatedly broken by aerial attacks. This is where no World War I in Spain comes in. Nobody had any experience of having your romantic military notions completely disabused by the harsh reality of machine warfare. If the strafing of an Italian Savoia didn't do it, the fear of being outflanked and encircled by Moorish mercenaries who were notorious for putting captured prisoners to the knife was usually enough to cause a panicked retreat. By August 10th, Yagué's forces had traveled nearly 200 miles. On the 14th, a pincers movement supported by artillery and air attacks easily overpowered the 2,000 defenders of the city of Badajoz. Yagué celebrated his victory by having thousands of Republicans led into the city's bull ring and machine-gunned to death. A few days later, in the Basque region, Moya's Carlist forces began an assault on the mining town of Irún on the French border. The defenders were CNT miners, Basque nationalists, and volunteer French communists. They held out for weeks in the hills surrounding Irún, tenaciously holding off the nationalists while enduring German and Italian aerial bombardment, including the dropping of leaflets threatening another Badajoz bull ring if surrender wasn't immediate. But the closure of the French border to arms shipments cut off ammunition resupply. The defenders fell back and burned the city before retreating across the French border on September 5th. San Sebastian fell soon after, but its leaders refused to allow CNT militants to burn it, so the city's arms and metalworking industry and port passed safely into nationalist hands. Having taken Badajoz and secured the length of the Portuguese border for the nationalists, Colonel Yagué turned his forces east toward Madrid, cutting through defenders with the same practiced ease and chewing up 300 miles of ground in 4 weeks. Soon the road to Madrid was clear for a lightning strike that would decapitate the Republic. But General Franco had other ideas, namely the relief of the Alcazar in Toledo. Toledo, in La Mancha, is an ancient city 50 miles southwest of Madrid, famous for the brutality of its Inquisition. The military governor there, José Moscardo, had not actually been informed of the general's plot. He was not considered important enough to get the memo, but when the rising began around him, he decided to support it anyway. So Moscardo refused to release weapons from the city's arms factory to the Republican government, and then brought all of the town's civil guard and prominent rightists in the town into the vicinity of the Alcazar, which is a huge medieval fortification that dominates Toledo. From July 21st onward, Moscardo and over 1,000 defenders and right-wing civilians withstood a siege by Republican forces. By August, the heroic resistance of the Alcazar had become a key part of the nationalist propaganda legend. At one point, the Republicans put Moscardo's son on the phone with him and said that they would kill him if he didn't surrender. And he gave a very stiff-necked, honorable response that he could not do so. And the legend became that they then executed his son. In actuality, they didn't go through with it, but he was executed later in retaliation for a nationalist bombing raid on Toledo. None of the legends have anything to say about the 100 or so left-wing hostages that they brought into the Alcazar with them and who were never heard from again. Franco decided that relieving Moscardo trumped taking Madrid, and ordered the redirection of his assault columns to the southeast. Colonel Yaguier protested so fiercely that he was temporarily removed from command. Throughout September, as Franco's forces neared, Republican efforts to take the Alcazar became more frantic. At one point, Largo Caballero, who had replaced Ural as prime minister, traveled to Toledo to detonate mines that had been dug under one of the building's towers as a photo opportunity. The tower fell, but the Alcazar stood. On September 27th, the Republicans made their final doomed assault on the Alcazar before Franco's troops entered the city. The relief of Colonel Moscardo became a huge propaganda coup for the nationalists, and the next day Franco was declared Generalissimo and leader of the Spanish state. The operation gave Franco the stature boost he desired, but the diversion gave Madrid precious time to reorganize its forces and prepare for Franco's assault. The Republican effort was aided by a change in Soviet policy. Stalin decided that since the Western democracies weren't going to take non-intervention seriously, neither would he, and therefore it was not in the interest of the USSR to allow a potentially sympathetic left-wing Western government to be destroyed so easily. A decision was made to defy the pathetic non-intervention committee that the British had spearheaded in August. In early September, José Ural had resigned as prime minister and been replaced by the only person with sufficient credibility among the workers to lead, Largo Caballero, the erstwhile Spanish Lenin, who headed the radical faction of the Socialist Party. Largo invited both the communists and the anarchists into his cabinet. The anarchists, of course, refused, and the leadership of the Spanish communists initially resisted before being ordered to by Moscow. This made Republican Spain the first Western government to have communists in its cabinet. In exchange for shipping the vast majority of Spain's gold reserves, fourth largest in the world, largely stockpiled during the boom years of World War I, nearly $800 million worth to Russia for safekeeping, Stalin sent tanks with Soviet drivers, aircraft with Soviet pilots, artillery, guns, and ammunition on ships disguised to get past Italian submarine patrols, and these began to arrive in October. By November 1st, there were 500 Soviet technical advisors in Spain, and Madrid cab drivers were being recruited to learn how to drive the T-26 tanks. It's important to remember that the Peninsular Army essentially had no tanks. They had no air force before the war began. Meanwhile, the European Communist parties and the Comintern coordinated a recruitment pipeline to gather left-wing volunteers willing to fight for the Republic in Paris and then sending them to Spain. The German and Italian volunteers were exiles from their own countries, eager to fight fascism wherever they could. French and English volunteers, frustrated by their own country's frozen political landscape, also flocked to join up. The majority of these international brigadiers were Communist Party members and members of the working class. A few were veterans of World War I, but most had no more military experience than the Spanish militiamen. The first group of 500 volunteers, mostly French, arrived in Barcelona from Paris on October 14th. The Communist Party created a clandestine network to get these guys into the country, and it was manned by people who would end up becoming significant figures in post-war communism. Joseph Broz, later known as Joseph Broz Tito, was one of the key figures in Paris getting international brigadiers across the border. And Enver Hoxha, the future bunker-building Albanian dictator, was a member of the International Brigade. While this was happening, Franco's forces were making a multi-directional assault on Madrid, made up of 3 columns of 10,000 legionnaires and regulares, which had 10,000 Carlist and Phalangists in support. The idea was to enter Madrid on October 13th, the feast of the Spanish race on the Catholic calendar, but neither side of the Spanish Civil War was good at keeping to schedules. With the assault columns nearing the western edge of Madrid, Largo's government began the process of replacing the independent union and party militias with mixed brigades under central authority. The model would be the Communist Party's 5th Battalion, which was noted for its iron discipline and precision drilling, and which was favored by the government with the best equipment and weaponry. The CNT militia units complained bitterly and on the Aragon front, many anarchists left the lines for Barcelona rather than submit to military discipline. But the influx of Soviet arms gave the central government a powerful incentive: submit to militarization or go unsupplied. On November 23rd, bombs fell on Madrid for the first time. 3 days later, the first batch of Soviet T-26 tanks were deployed west of the city. They scattered the nationalist cavalry. Yes, there was a cavalry. That's still going on. But the Spanish troops meant to support their advance failed to keep up with them. On both sides, a shortage of trucks would be a persistent hindrance on tank tactics. This war is often thought of as a laboratory for tank strategy. And it was. Like, Germans got a lot of ideas for the Blitz from Spain. And it's an interesting contrast in doctrine between the two sides, because the Spanish military brass in the Republic was old-fashioned peninsular guys. They went by the French military tradition, which said, spread your tanks around in a thin line interspersed with infantry. The German advisors to the nationalists said, fuck that, concentrate them. And they would fight these battles and you would get results. The problem was none of the results meant much because due to the constant lack of trucks to get infantrymen to go and fill the space made by a tank attack, for the most part, tank attacks would go unsupported and they would have to turn around anyway because they couldn't get guys into the gap fast enough. So, overrated feature of the war because of the just chronic lack of supplies, because these war economies that end up dominating the globe are still at this very moment being spun up. Moroccan regulares deployed gasoline bombs against the tanks, the first recorded use of what would later be known as Molotov cocktails. Soon after, the CNT finally agreed to join Largo's government, creating the incongruous situation of an anarchist justice minister and an anarchist director of prisons. By early November, the fall of the capital seemed inevitable. Over the objection of the anarchists, the cabinet agreed to evacuate to Valencia in the south. On the night of November 6th, the prime minister and top government officials left Madrid. On the way out, they actually got hassled, and a few of them were arrested by anarchist patrols. President Azana had departed for Barcelona earlier and would spend the rest of the war stewing in impotent, self-regarding agony. As soon as the rising happens, Azana essentially dusts his hands clean of the entire affair and spends the war writing catty, mean diary entries about how everybody else in the government's an idiot and a jerk. Moya would just go off on what a piece of shit Azana was, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. When you consider especially how much responsibility he held for creating the situation that led to the war and his absolute blithe refusal to see the rising coming. Madrid was under the command of a defense junta led by General Mieja, an ambiguous revolutionary to say the least, who had found himself behind Republican lines after the rising. There's a story he told as he was being held up by the communists, no less. The communists would end up flattering him so much that he would join the party. But he tells a story about someone watching someone else drowned in a lake and then getting pushed in, and when they're in the water, accidentally rescuing the person who was drowning. And he said, but who pushed me in? Yep. Phil Collins' ass. Now the Communist Party hailed him as the savior of the city, and the abandonment of the government provoked a mass mobilization. Fear transformed into determination as the people of Madrid threw up barricades and dug trenches, while La Pasionera exhorted them from the radio with the famous words, "No pasarán, they shall not pass." The unions mobilized by profession, with battalions of barbers and tailors and school teachers and graphic artists defending the city. During this period, the largest single Republican massacre of the war occurred when 2,000 high-profile right-wingers in the Madrid model prison were evacuated, ostensibly to keep them out of the hands of the nationalists, and then executed on the road outside Madrid. On November 5th, nationalist troops made their first probing attacks into the west of Madrid, but the Republicans received a stroke of luck when the battle plan was found on the body of a dead nationalist tank officer. The Republicans knew which attacks were feints and which were real, so they were able to concentrate their defenses, massing huge numbers of reserves behind the front lines. On November 8th, the nationalist assault began across the Casa de Campo, the former royal hunting grounds. Low on ammunition and training, the defenders held the line, and that night, the 1st International Brigade, made up mostly of German and French communists, marked into action. The next day saw brutal house-to-house fighting and the German brigadiers saw massive casualties as Benaventura Durruti arrived with 3,000 members of his CNT militia column from Aragon. Durruti hoped to gain some glory for the anarchists during a defense of Madrid that was becoming a purely communist affair, but his troops were cowed by the massed machine gun and artillery fire of the nationalists and failed to advance. On November 19th, nationalist forces found a gap in the Republican line and pushed through to the campus of the University of Madrid, 200 yards from the city itself. This is house by house, building by building fighting on a college campus, which leads to some wildly cinematic incidents. At one point, some German international brigadiers put dynamite into an elevator and send it up to legionnaires on another floor, Die Hard style. And at one point, a number of Moroccans who were held down in a science lab got hungry and ate infected lab animals and got sick. The 19th was also the day that anarchist hero Benaventura Durruti was shot in mysterious circumstances. It was either an accidental discharge, a stray bullet, a communist assassination, or the work of an anarchist who feared Durruti was abandoning the ideal, according to who you ask. One way or another, he died the next day, the same day that Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera was shot after being convicted of treason, robbing anarchism and phalangism of their most dynamic exponents. Durruti's body was sent to Catalonia, and his funeral on November 23rd saw 500,000 mourners fill the streets of Barcelona. None knew it at the time, but in many ways it was the funeral for Spanish anarchism as well.
Viva la quinta brigada, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Viva la quinta brigada, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Que nos cubrirá de glorias, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Que nos cubrirá de glorias, ay Carmela, ay Carmela.
The fighting in University City was brutal and intimate, but eventually the nationalist assault ground to a halt, and Franco ended the offensive. Instead, Madrid was to be subjected to a massive artillery and aerial bombardment meant to break morale. On December 4th, 46 tons of bombs were dropped on Madrid from German aircraft. Now, this is a paltry number compared to the later aerial campaigns of World War II, but this is the first sustained air attack on a civilian population in world history. The effect was the opposite of that intended. Local committees were formed to provide aid for people driven from their homes by shelling, and defiant solidarity was the order of the day. For the moment, Madrid was safe. The nationalists dug in around the city and soon began a series of campaigns to encircle it. The first American volunteers, who would soon join the Abraham Lincoln Battalion of the International Brigades, began arriving in Barcelona from Paris in late December. Their travel had been arranged by the Communist Party of the United States through various charity front groups. Alone among the international contingent, which was composed primarily of workers, the largest single group of American volunteers were students. Second largest were sailors. Some of the other international troops thought the Americans were a little soft. The Canadian battalion, named the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, was a bunch of burly-ass lumberjacks, and they would call the American volunteers New York Ice Cream Boys, because it was thought that they were all a bunch of nerds from the city college. But that makes sense, because in America, they were further away from the fascist threat than their European compatriots. So the Lincoln volunteers tended to have a more romantic view of their attachment to the struggle than the Europeans did. About 10% of the American volunteers were Jewish, which reflected the general desire to stand up for their fellows suffering under fascism. Lincoln Battalion was also notable for being racially integrated, with several Black Americans serving as officers. These young green soldiers, few of them with any military experience, showed up just in time to participate in one of the first major battles around the Jarama River, east of Madrid, where Franco's forces were attempting to cut the road from the capital to Valencia. Franco had had an opportunity to sever the connection during the initial attack on Madrid, but he'd intentionally left it open to allow the city's defenders to retreat rather than force them to fight a battle to the death among the rubble of the city, and he would come to regret that decision. The nationalist attack on the west bank of the Jarama on February 5th caught the Republicans by surprise. They were thrown back with heavy losses. But the defenders were able to eventually throw up a line long enough for the Republic to organize a counterattack, which broke the nationalist momentum. This was the Abraham Lincoln Battalion's baptism by fire, and without much military training or even artillery support, they helped stem the tide at the cost of over nearly 300 killed and wounded out of 10,000 total casualties on the Loyalist side. Not bad for some New York ice cream boys. On the Nationalist side, another group of foreign volunteers had their first encounter with the elephant. 700 Irish Catholic nationalists, many of them from the blue shirt fascist movement, led by the pro-treaty IRA leader Ian O'Duffy, had volunteered to fight for Franco and the Holy Virgin. At Jarama, they lost 4 killed in a friendly fire incident before being taken from action, never to return. Great job. Another sterling page in the history of Irish military valor. While the Republic held the line at Jarama, farther to the south the line snapped. A force composed mostly of Italian fascist quote-unquote volunteers captured the port city of Malaga, giving the Nationalists their first Mediterranean port on the mainland. 4,000 Loyalist prisoners were shot in the first week of occupation, a toll that appalled the Italian commander. By this time, there were 40,000 Italian troops in Spain. Hitler, keen to avoid provoking a Europe-wide war he wasn't ready for, limited German investment in Spain to the Condor Legion, which was mostly an independently commanded mobile air force and eventually numbered 12,000 ideologically motivated Nazi volunteers. Mussolini, fresh from colonial victory in Ethiopia, sought to display the might of Italian arms on the continent itself. By mid-February, there were 40,000 Italian troops in Spain, and a squadron of Italian submarines patrolled the Mediterranean from a base on Majorca, hunting loyal naval vessels and Russian supply ships. Including regular Italian army units, the Spanish force consisted of a number of black shirt militias with cool names like the Black Flames and the Black Arrows. Some were committed fascists, but many were unemployed southern Italians just looking for a paycheck. Mussolini arranged with Franco to allow the Italian forces to launch a showcase tank offensive on the Republican line at Guadalajara, northeast of Madrid. This attack had originally been conceived as the northern arm of a pincer's move to occur simultaneously with the Jarama offensive, but logistical challenges and bad weather had delayed it. Now, the Italians could use the assault as a grand violent statement to the world. The communists and old powers of Europe would quake before this display of Italian military strength. The Italians had initial success pushing back Republican forces, but they soon stalled for the lack of fuel and poor coordination, allowing for the Republic to organize a powerful counteroffensive that threw the Italians back. Again, casualties were ghastly. At times, the battle resembled an Italian civil war in miniature, with black shirts engaged in pitched battles with left-wing Italian exiles of the Garibaldi Battalion. And this is another fun thing about the international brigades. Because these guys are communists, even if they're workers, they're kind of nerds, which means they love their history and they love giving their units names of their heroes. So you've got the Garibaldi Battalion of Italians, you have the Thälmann Battalion of Germans named after Ernst Thälmann, the imprisoned head of the German Communist Party. You've got the Abraham Lincoln and George Washington battalions in the United States. The Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, named after the guys who led the Upper and Lower Canada revolts of 1837. But that's what they had. Instead of a religious tradition, they had a radical tradition. The Republican counteroffensive gained more territory than it had been lost to begin with. Guadalajara was the first Republican victory of any size besides the successful defense of Madrid. Mussolini's forces were humiliated. European military observers saw the failure of the Italian tank tactics as an indication that armor was going to kind of be overrated. Maybe tanks aren't going to be that important. But the Germans, however, who were there and watched the whole thing carry out, just chalked it up to a skills issue. These are Italians we're talking about. Of course, they didn't know how to do a tank attack. For Franco, the failure of the Italians at Guadalajara was a secret boon. It humiliated Mussolini and strengthened his position as the undisputed leader of the nationalist movement, just as he was ready to move to neutralize his political rivals. In April, Franco announced that the Phalange and the Carlists, groups whose membership had swollen into the millions since the uprising, would be merged into a single party, which would be the official and only legal political organization in nationalist Spain. The not at all awkwardly named Fet y la Dariones, which stands for Traditionalist Spanish Phalanx of the Councils of Nationalist Syndicalist Offensive. He did this without consulting the leadership of either group and quickly arrested top Phalangists and Carlists on subversion charges. The new party would combine the Phalangist blue shirt and the Carlist red beret, but be purged of both movements' anti-capitalism. Franco was more than happy to chart a course for Spanish modernity and capitalism, provided that the working class and Frenchified liberals had no hand in the steering. Also in April, Moya's troops moved against the last bastion of the Basque Republic of Euskadi in the province of Vizcaya. Without the forces or supplies to puncture the line around Madrid, the nationalists' best target was the smaller, isolated northern coastal pocket of Republican control that ran east-west from the Basque Country to Santander to Asturias. During the campaign, Condor Legion aircraft bombed the defenseless city of Guernica, killing over 1,000 people and destroying 70% of the city's buildings. The nationalists accused the Reds of burning Guernica, but couldn't get anyone else to agree. The city had no strategic value or war industry. It may have been destroyed to block the path of retreating loyalist troops, or it may have been one of the Condor Legion's many experiments in military terror. In any event, the bombing scandalized the world, and after nearly a year of squawking about red terror and dead priests and raped nuns, the major organs of the bourgeois Western press began to express sympathy for the Republican cause. And this joined the overwhelming artistic consensus in the West. All of the best poets and writers and journalists, they all supported the Republic in romantic, flowing language, and it had absolutely no effect on the policies of any of the Western governments. But with non-intervention established policy, no shift in international attitudes towards the Republic could make up for the centripetal forces that were pulling it apart from within. The waging of the war was building state capacity in both zones, but while that capacity was being harnessed to the personal rule of Franco and the nationalist zone, in the Republic, state and economic powers were being divided into factions. The three main forces outside Euskadi were the socialists in government, grouped around Prime Minister Largo Caballero and War Minister Indelicio Prieto. Largo and Prieto hated each other, but they were united in their distrust of the Spanish Communist Party, whose membership had exploded since the Rising to over 250,000. These new communists, by and large, did not come from the Spanish working class, but from the ranks of the middle class and the military. In the words of the communist commander of the Spanish Air Force, the radical aristocrat Hidalgo de Cisneros, these young officials of various ministries, ambitious young men of the upper middle class who now declared themselves communist, did so because it meant joining the strongest group and having a share in the disciplined power. Discipline is a fetish for the communists throughout the war. Discipline is generated by certainty. Certainty is generated by hierarchy. And that hierarchy is anchored by the state power of the USSR, the only worker state in the world, trusted to guide a global working class victory. And all laboring on that cause is glorious, worthy of all sacrifice, including the sacrifice of individual judgment. And it's that commitment that will galvanize and discipline the Spanish communists into such an effective machine so that exercises influence far outside their numbers. A force multiplier of faith that a communist headed the technical secretariat, which dispensed pay, promotions, and supplies. Beyond their control over the bureaucracy, the discipline of the communists, coupled with their adherence to the Moscow line of tactical alliance with the liberal bourgeois, made them an attractive choice for those threatened by the anarchist social revolution. The communists were the party of the smallholding peasant in the countryside and the small businessman in the city, defending their rights to ownership against the collectivist demands of the CNT. They were advancing in Spain in 1937 what had been the Menshevik line in Russia in 1917. The proletarian revolution could only occur once the bourgeois revolution had been secured. With privileged access to Soviet war material, the communists soon gained overpowering influence in the chambers of government, the police, and military. Opposing both the socialist-led cabinet and the increasingly communist-led administrative state were the anarchists of the CNT, whose collectives dominated the urban economy of Barcelona and the agricultural economy of Aragon, and whose armed forces protected those economies. Throughout the early months of 1937, the Communist-Liberal Coalition's effort to limit anarchist military independence and defend smallholders against collectivization led to an escalating series of clashes. In January, local smallholding peasants, supported by Communist Party members, fought with collectivist forces in La Fatarella in Catalonia. CNT control patrols from Barcelona arrived and opened fire on the individualists, killing several. This is some abyss-looking back shit. An anarchist patrol rides into a rural town and shoots protesters just as the civil guard had done before the war. Beyond that, there were tit-for-tat murders of anarchists and communists in Madrid throughout the spring. The paranoia of the pre-war moment returned, with both sides sure that the other was about to annihilate them. But only the communists had the capacity to act. The ambitious bourgeois and military opportunists who flocked to join the Communist Party may not have believed in the world revolution, but they did believe in a Republican victory, if only to save their own necks, and they were willing to submit to the discipline of a party that they saw as the only force capable of delivering one. This meant that the communists, the leadership of the Spanish Party in consultation with their Soviet advisors, were able to formulate strategies and courses of action, which the anarchists could only ever react to. The CNT's cherished horizontalism meant that the leaders of the movement, those with access to privileged information and political power within the national and Catalan governments, were effectively at the mercy of the actions of the various grassroots committees, dominated by anarchist activists who were constitutionally allergic to the exercise of power. So while the PSUC, the communists in Catalonia, initiated a plan to ally with the Generalitat to neutralize the CNT, then ally with the central government to neutralize the Generalitat, the anarchists could not organize a preemptive strike. They could only denounce the creeping authoritarianism of the communists and concentrate on advancing their social revolution. The record of industrial collectivization in Barcelona was decidedly mixed. Inefficiencies and lack of raw materials and credit, which was often caused by intentional deprivations by the government, as well as competition between collectives, hindered production. But at the same time, Barcelona's collective economy was a wonder to behold. Before the war, Barcelona had barely any heavy manufacturing and no arms industry to speak of. Anarchists built an arms industry that by the end of 1937 employed 50,000 workers in 500 factories. This is from a situation where there had been a single automobile plant in Barcelona before the war. The entire woodworking industry in Catalonia was vertically integrated, with CNT workers' committees controlling the production process from felling trees to turning lumber into boards to carpentry to retail sales, all one vertically integrated enterprise. The equalization of salaries created savings that were pumped into unemployment insurance, old age pensions, free medical and childcare. But while these results have inspired generations of anarchists ever since, they did not win the CNT any new admirers among Catalonia's bourgeois and non-anarchist workers. It wasn't long after the beginning of the social revolution in Barcelona that so many people had flocked to the UGT that it actually outnumbered the CNT in the city. Exacerbating and accelerating the conflict between the anarchists and the Popular Front in Barcelona was the chronic, gnawing, destabilizing effect of food shortages in the city. Black markets flourished, leading to the demoralizing spectacle of fashionable restaurants coexisting with massive bread lines. Anarchists blamed the communists for ending the system of rationing and food committees the CNT had set up after the Rising. The communists blamed the agricultural collectives for consuming their surplus rather than sending it to the cities. Fights between assault guards and hungry citizens in front of food shops flared up repeatedly, and the issue of scarcity drove the grassroots of the FAI and the CNT into deeper hostility to the Catalan and central governments. This conflict between the communist-liberal alliance that dominated in Barcelona and Madrid governments came to a head in late April. The Madrid CNT newspaper published a letter from that anarchist director of prisons, Melchor Rodriguez, exposing a private prison and interrogation facility used by the communists in the Madrid defense junta. In response, the newspaper was shut down. That didn't stop Prime Minister Largo Caballero from dissolving the junta and appointing a new governing body in Madrid. Barcelona's CNT newspaper denounced the actions of the communists in Madrid on the same day that an influential communist in the city was shot dead in the streets, presumed by everyone the victim of anarchists. In late April, the CNT militiamen guarding the border posts between Catalonia and France in the Pyrenees Mountains were replaced by Carabinieri, whose numbers had been substantially increased by Finance Minister Juan Negrin, the Finance Ministry being in charge of the border patrols. In typical wartime hyperbole, the Carbonari were called the 100,000 Sons of Dr. Negrin, which reflects the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, who were the French reactionaries who invaded in the 19th century. There were actually about 40,000 of them, but 100,000 sounds way better. A justification for a move against the anarchists was provided on May 2nd, when a CNT telephone operator in the Telefonica building cut into a call between Republican President Azana and Catalan President Companys and told them that there were more important uses for the line than the bleeding of two gas bags. The next day, Commissioner Rodriguez Sayas led his forces into the Telefonica building to reclaim them. By that night, barricades had gone up around the city. Soon, there was a tense standoff between the government forces who controlled Barcelona east of the central Rambles pedestrian road, only about 10% of the total city, and the anarchists and their allies in the Palm, who controlled the west, as well as the working-class suburbs and artillery in the Montjuïc castle overlooking the city. The anarchists had a dominating position, and a concerted offensive would have swept all before them. But there was no central authority within the anarchist movement to order or coordinate such an attack. And the CNT leadership was meanwhile focused on brokering a peaceful settlement. While those negotiations continued in Valencia, sporadic gunfire racked Barcelona. Cars that drove down the wrong road were riddled with bullets. A theater filled with civil guard was blown up with dynamite. When news of the showdown hit the Aragon front, former members of the anarchist Iron Column, which had reluctantly been integrated into the formal military, prepared to head to Barcelona to confront the communists. But while the CNT activists in Barcelona mobilized to defend their revolution, with 7,000 armed libertarian socialists in the streets, the CNT leadership was paralyzed by their conflicting imperatives: continuing the social revolution and winning the civil war. The communists had gained such massive influence so quickly by emphasizing the need to prioritize defeating the nationalists over any other considerations, a viewpoint that brought together a motley class coalition that was united only by their desire not to be shot or sent to one of Franco's dungeons. Until this point, the CNT had insisted that defending and expanding the social revolution was the only way to win the war, that the popular enthusiasm unleashed by collective economic activity and military cooperation would power the Republic to victory. But now defending the social revolution would mean declaring open war on the entire Popular Front government and risk losing the war against fascism. It was a step no one in the CNT leadership was willing to take, even though the activists on the ground were more than willing to make a definitive stand for libertarian society. So while the Iron Columnists gathered their arms, CNT leader and Justice Minister Juan Garcia Oliver made a radio address calling for peace, which prevented the anarchist troops from moving on Barcelona. The PAUM made an offer to the CNT to ally against the communists, but were rebuffed. Prime Minister Caballero was frozen, hostile to the anarchists, but unwilling to back the play of the communists and increase their power. Eventually, an agreement was reached to dissolve and reorganize the Catalan government to dilute communist influence, but the barricades stayed up. Finally, on May 7th, 5,000 assault guards sent by Naval Minister Prieto arrived in the city to oversee the dismantling of the battle lines. 500 people were killed, and another 1,000 wounded during what would become known euphemistically as the May events. The Generalitat would be reconstituted, with each political faction given a single representative, but the CNT decision to stand down was the beginning of the end of the social revolution in Catalonia and Aragon. The mandate of the Republican government would be victory at all costs, including the elimination of economic collectivization and political pluralism. Communist will and Soviet arms and expertise would now be unleashed. War had finally turned the defunct Spanish state into not one modern war machine, but two.
Arriba los pobres del mundo, arriba todos a luchar por la justicia proletaria. Nuevo mundo nace ya. Destrocemos todas las cadenas de esclavitud tradicional. Y